There we go. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the second meeting of DSTAC. The working groups have been incredibly busy the last 6 weeks. I've been very impressed with the amount of work that you've accomplished. And we'll look forward to hearing from both of you today. Working Group 1 will present this morning, Working Group 2 this afternoon. Brendan, did you want to call the roll?
Sure, we'll take a quick roll. Start over here with Dr. Ansari.
Ahmad Ansari, AT&T. Brent Campbell with Sony.
John Card, Dish Network.
Bob Klein, Cablevision.
Adam Goldberg for Public Knowledge.
Mark Hess, Comcast.
Brad Love with Hauppauge.
Ken Lowe with Vizio.
Bruce McClellan with Eris.
John McCoskey, Motion Picture Association.
Milo Medine from Google.
Alan Mesa, Samsung.
Jay Rolls with Charter.
Brent Smith, Evolution.
Joe Weber, TiVo.
Robin Wilson, Nigro.
Matthew Clark, Amazon.
And Professor Sethi Madhavan had emailed me and said he'll be here by 11, so he had a flight delay. One other matter of business I wanted to ask everyone. I've prepared minutes for the first meeting. I can either email them, or if anyone wants a hard copy, raise your hand. No? Okay. So I will email them, and then at the next meeting, if anyone has any edits or anything, you can just email them to the DSTAC chain, and we'll incorporate those.
Okay. So should we start with Working Group 1? Jay?
Launch right into this.
Yeah. How did you want to proceed?
I thought I'd have a moment to sort of...
Ron, we're really not...
Did you get coffee?
I did get coffee. You wouldn't know it. Okay, so Jay Rolls with Charter, and I and Milo are the scribes for Working Group 1, and we've collected some highlights of our discussions. We've summarized this into a document that I actually have not distributed to the whole DSTAC, but I imagine I should, and so we'll plan to do that. I'll do it at the break or something. So
that's fine.
We are wrapping up a final draft, as you know, last night.
Right.
So
I suppose we should be clear that these are not the final work products yet.
Correct.
They're still both working groups are works in progress.
These are sort of readouts of a summary readout of what happened during our working group meetings and our calls since we last met face to face. So, reminder that Working Group 1 set out to work on commercial requirements and also to touch on a little bit of what kind of threats and security concerns we may have from a business perspective. And so we decided to sort of chunk this up into a couple of different areas, 5 different areas actually, to sort of attack each topic. And we had, of course, a diversity of experts inside the working group, so we divvied it up a little bit like that. So the 5 categories that we split this up into were MVPDs, which I've noticed is an acronym that just does not roll off the tongue, but operators, maybe that's easier. CE and device manufacturers is the second one. Consumer, sort of a view of commercial requirements from a consumer standpoint. Number 3, content providers and programmers, number 4, and security, number 5. And so those were kind of how we divvied it up. And then we had some folks go off in each of those categories. We had materials submitted, ideas, thoughts, and then those members came back to the working group and sort of submitted some written material first, and then we did verbal readouts. So we've tried to capture in this document that we'll send around both the what happened as far as written material that was submitted, as well as some of the verbal discussions that happen on these topics. So we will have. So that's how we're going to spend the time this morning, is in the same manner, sort of do a little bit of a readout from some of the working group members on these 5 topics. And so I will, what we're going to do, and I would encourage any of the working group members to chime in as well if we're, leaving something out. But John Card from DISH and myself will talk a little bit about MVBD requirements. Adam, let's see what was next. I think it was, no, I'm sorry. We have device manufacturer Brad. Is Brad here? There's Brad. Brad Love will do a readout on device manufacturer requirements. And then on consumer, Adam Goldberg will do a readout on those. And then content providers will be John Mikowski. And lastly, Robin Wilson for security requirements. So with that, I'll just launch into some of the summary on MVBD, and then John will sort of fill in any gaps I leave, and also probably cover some material that I'll just not cover. So does that sound good, Cheryl?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
No, that's perfect.
So from an operator's standpoint, there was a vast number of things to consider as far as requirements, and we did capture a lot of ideas. I'll hit on the highlights. So first, sort of touching on the topic of security and content protection, which gets a little bit to the heart of some of the things that we've been talking about. A reminder that we as operators have to follow certain compliance and robustness rules in regard to security and how resistant devices must be that generate content and receive and transmit content, how devices need to manage content and copies of content, the retransmission, the use and restrictions in order to prevent privacy and also to protect content holders' rights. There's quite a bundle there that I think most of the people, I don't think this is news to anybody on the committee. Everybody recognizes that these rules exist and it's an environment that we live in, and we have to protect, the content providers and their material. There's quite a bit about licensing and rights and obligations. We talked quite a bit about that, and we did touch on, I think Robin will cover this in more detail. Where is Robin? There's Robin. Robin will probably talk a little bit more in detail about some of the technology aspects of these protections, but this concept of hardware root of trust and varying degrees of how strictly we have to be careful about protecting content came up multiple times, and it's another reality of our business. So on consumer protection obligations, John, go ahead.
Actually, one additional point that came in from the DBS side is because of our national footprint, we've also got some locality rules that we have to follow that are kind of just easy, I'll say, quote unquote, for a service provider that has a single DMA in their market. So DBS has some more advanced kinds of requirements that are placed on us by the law and by FCC regulations, and we covered a little bit of that too. So.
Moving on to consumer protection obligations, there are obviously regulatory requirements that we have to observe as operators. Those include, for instance, things like emergency alerts, closed captioning, even limitations on web links that can be shown to children, privacy, protection of information that has to do with viewing habits of consumers. These are all of those, I believe, are covered under regulatory obligations, and we think that a downloadable security solution also needs to comply with these legal requirements that are placed on service providers. Nextly, the execution of a service provider, a video provider's service offering. All of us assemble and market different services branded in different ways. We include different programming. We integrate data. We have interactive features. We have features that interact with other devices and other parts of our services. We all have a guide. We have software that enforces the content providers' requirements. These are all a basket of our aspects of our service, and if there's a poor service experience because we don't get that right, or a third-party device doesn't get that right, that does impact our customers and their relationship with us. So we thought that was important to call out and note as a piece of the puzzle here in regards to MVPDs. So,
Jay, I think one of the things that did come up in the group was there is a bit of difference of opinion about what constitutes the service, right? That is to say, is it on the minimalist side just linear TV and on demand, or is it the full panoply of capabilities in terms of customer portals, caller ID? I mean, the guide, metadata, all the rest of that. And so I think part of the question about this, and it leads to some of the comments on disaggregation later, how you view what the definition of services is very important to setting that context properly.
Right. And I think, speaking as an operator that's been around for a while, I think that it's not like 10 years ago where we had channels and we had maybe a guide, and maybe it was a halfway usable guide. Things have come a long way, and we as you know, we spent quite a bit of time talking about all these pretty sophisticated features that are all part of this bundle now that are pretty important to us, we believe. So, and then 3 more items here, and then I'll let John camp on. So customer support is, anybody who's in the operator business knows that customer support is really key to consumer satisfaction. And so there are a lot of tools that are part of good customer support these days. We build these tools into our devices in some way or another, and having continued support for those kind of tools we think is important so that we're able to extend the best customer service that we can. We added a note about change. We all know that our environments are changing much more dramatically and faster than we've ever dealt with, and I think in some respects, the way that, speaking for cable, John, you can speak for DBS, but for cable, we've been in some ways fortunate because we've been able to stick to a pretty staid and true formula technology-wise for delivering things. It's been MPEG-2. It's been on a QAM on our RF plant, and MPEG-2 we've been using as an example for at least 15 years. That is going to change as well too. I mean, MPEG-4 has already been around for a while, H.264, and then now you've got HEVC, which is a new encoding method that's particularly targeted at 4K ultra high def TV. I think that the pace of the technology change is gonna happen a lot faster, and so just a reminder that not only is the operator's equipment under threat of being obsoleted at a more rapid pace, but anybody else that's going to be plugging and playing with this ecosystem is has the same issue that they may have to deal with. So, John?
Yeah, so in the DBS world, I try to provide to the working group some examples of the kinds of changes that are regular and expected. We just went through daylight savings time change, the country, or most of the parts of the country. And as a DBS operator, we really do care about the fact that the state of Arizona doesn't actually do the daylight savings time, but the various Native American reservations do, as do the national parks. That actually matters to how you broadcast your system and what specific details you get down. So there are regular and expected changes like that. Services that change and are various service parameters that change that add up to hundreds of changes a week. Those are the way we build our systems, and we understand how to run those. Over longer periods of time, Jay touched on the MPEG-4. I think the DBS operators launched MPEG-4 quite a bit before other operators because we are relying on the efficiencies of that to make up for the fact that we have limited bandwidth. There are laws of physics that we operate under that we are trying to figure out how to break them, but not there yet. We've also got some technologies like DVRs are used in a different manner in a DBS environment than in a cable environment or a IPTV environment. We rely on them in different ways. So, yeah, we did try to provide as many useful and illustrative examples of changes that are just kind of a part of the normal operation or the expected operation. And then in the case of DBS also, we've gone through a couple smart card swaps each DBS operator has. And so the changes that are required when the security system is broken, and coming back to the DSTAC's mission, to talk about downloadable software, that's something that I'm very interested in understanding how a downloadable software system is going to react to changes and is going to need to be renewed or replaced or thrown out and start over again if in kind of a worst case world. We plan for the worst case. We expect to operate in the best case, and reality falls somewhere in between in the DBS world.
Thanks, John. And then lastly, intellectual property. Intellectual property and licensing looms very large in our business, and we operate within the limits of some of the bounds that are placed on us there. We have to respect conditions of copyright licenses from commercial video content providers. That's typically included in our bilateral negotiated affiliation and retransmission agreements. Obviously, we have to respect intellectual property, IP. We license data that is part of guides and buy that on a commercial basis. Patents, it runs the gamut, and the committee did spend quite a bit of time talking about licenses and the complex landscape here of how licenses impact our business, both technology and agreements with content providers. So John, I'll stop there and
sure. There are a couple other points. So. There are a couple other points that probably are worthy of mention at this time to the membership as a whole. We presented some requirements in support of normal business operations. In other words, growing the business, maintaining customer relationships, being able to envision how am I going to bring in 3D TV or 4K TV, and how is that going to become a part of the service I offer to my customers? How many of my customers are going to be interested in it versus how many of, in the case of DBS, both DBS operators still operate a large number of MPEG-2, I'll call them old-fashioned, but they're not. MPEG-2 standard definition channels are still sent out into most of the local markets across the U.S. because we've got a large number of customers who simply are not interested yet in high-definition television. They will be at some point. That's kind of expected, but they are in a different place in the change curve than early adopters or even than maybe you might say the mainstream is. When DBS got in the conversation, we also talked about service installation. And there is, at one point in time, both operators had a pretty well-developed self-install process. It was possible to go to your local Radio Shack or Best Buy or elsewhere and get a kit, climb up on your own roof. The receivers supported point dish. I've done it twice successfully. And a third time, I decided not to do that. And ironically, it was on a flat roof where I was in least danger of falling off in my current building. But over time, as the operators have launched more satellites in more orbital positions, it's become harder and harder to perform a successful self-install. And so that's a change that the business has gone through, but it's also a distinction between a cable operator or some of the IPTV operators and DBS, in that professional install is kind of a necessary part for a successful experience from our point of view as well as the customer point of view. Advertising is also something we touched on briefly. Again, the DBS operators have been able to leverage our use of DVRs in homes and to provide some DVR inserted ads. Most recently, for example, we talked about the 2016 elections, and most recently would be the 2014 elections. I'm way ahead of myself. The 2014 elections, we were able to.
Know how that turned out, so we
yeah, my crystal ball cracked this morning. I'm sorry. 2014 elections, we were able to do some interesting things because we had some common elements from a commercial standpoint. We were able to offer some common capabilities, which made our combined offering for carrying, quote, commercials on the commercial systems more attractive to more entities. We've touched on some other kinds of requirements. I think they'll show up in the final report. Overall, we're ready to start the reconciliation. We've heard from Brad and others about their kinds of requirements in some of these areas, like intellectual property and licensing. And I don't yet know what the final reconciliation is going to be, but we are, I think, continuing to make some progress. I hope that we're mostly done in requirements gathering, although I do want to raise to the DSTAC as a whole. We asked about over-the-top in the first meeting and got kind of a fuzzy answer, so our work has been kind of fuzzy in the area of over-the-top. I'd hope by the end of the day to have some understanding if we should be spending enough time to understand the over-the-top environment or not. Either is, I think we're prepared to go either way. There's obviously more work if we need to address it, but there may be some necessary pieces that we need to look at. If there's on the order of 1 billion devices in the U.S. that are tablets and mobile devices, then ignoring over the top and spending our time on 100,000 commercial receivers or third-party receivers seems like maybe we're missing the forest for a whole bunch of trees. That's it. I'm happy to answer questions and share information. I've sent most of the information off to Workgroup 2 members to keep you guys apprised of where we're at. And I think my part's done. Jay?
So just to summarize, we really feel quite strongly about our service as a whole being made available when someone takes services from an MVBD, whether it be on our device or somebody else's device. And so hopefully there's clarity in how we summarize in those comments. So moving on, I'm going to actually shift a little bit. I think that perhaps we should have done consumer first because we do want to put the consumer at the beginning of this and maybe work backward. I'm thinking like an engineer, on a diagram. But so Adam will talk about consumer requirements, and then I'll go to Brad. So
talk. Okay, there we go. While they adjust which mic is which. So I guess you stole my thunder, Jay. I mean, I think that primarily we need to make sure that whatever we end up with here serves serves the consumer being able to watch television, and so that's sort of fundamental to what I think we should be trying to do. So the sorts of things that are requirements for from a consumer perspective are both maybe a little higher level than some of the details that we have just and we'll get into, but are also sort of fundamental to what I think we're trying to do. So the set of things that we need from a consumer perspective includes the ability to for unaffiliated third-party manufacturers to build navigation devices that people can buy in stores and use for whatever their service is, whichever sort of MVPD they subscribe to, and be able to switch between MVPDs, be able to move across country and have a device that still continues to work wherever they land. It needs to the system, whatever we come up with, needs to support a range of retail devices like this. Simple ones that are maybe aimed at the sorts of folks that John has that still watch standard definition, and much fancier devices, and have a range of features, functions, and capabilities. Different customers have different needs. The system needs to enable these retail devices access to the full set of video services that are enabled by that are delivered by the MVPD. In particular, things like pay-per-view and video on demand should be incorporated in the system, and some other sort of more complicated linear services, like things that are delivered using Switch Digital, need to be enabled on retail devices. The system needs to allow retail devices to provide their own user interface, to format the screens and the way content is selected, navigated to, and dealt with. It needs to enable manufacturers to build their own sort of user interface that accesses the service delivered by the MVPD, as well as it should probably also enable a device to merely display the operator's user interface. I said a few minutes ago about how devices, the system needs to enable devices at various points in the marketplace, in simpler devices and more complex devices, and I suspect that somewhere in that range there are devices that would prefer to build their own user interface, and somewhere in there are devices that would prefer to just use some sort of interface supplied by the MVPD. And then next, the system in particular needs to only require what it needs to require, and not everything. This means things like the system needs to require some things like content protection related, but things which are maybe things that make a product good rather than make a product possible shouldn't be required. That is, we need to enable as many choices as possible by the devices, so that consumers have the full range of possibilities to choose from, and the marketplace will allow the best products to succeed and serve the consumers' needs in the best possible way. And then I believe this is finally, of course, the system needs to support necessary aspects of an MVPD service, things like emergency alert, closed captioning, and VCHIP. These things need to be, of course, enabled by the system, so that these controls and accessibility features and things are continue to be useful and usable by consumers. Maybe I went a little fast. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Adam. And if you heard a couple things there that seem like Adam and I are not totally in sync, I think that's true. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit. So at the end here. So Brad, Love from Halpage is going to talk about CE or retail device requirements.
Hi. Hello. So I'll be touching on some similar things to Adam. The things that a CE company and a manufacturer would like to see was the user interface. The system should support but not require third-party manufacturers to supply their own user interfaces. Such user interfaces should have access to all the linear channels, VOD and PPV, and remote presentation of the user interface shall be supported, but not required. So if a manufacturer decides to make a device that's pure video without a user interface, that option should be there. One of the points is to enable a competitive market with choice, and I do think that the user interface is one way for there to be choice in the market and diverse ecosystem. Universal provider terms. We'd like all content providers to have common copy control instructions. Whether this be signaling or embedding of the copy control data, it should be required for all programs that are transmitted. And recording shall not be prohibited for non-premium programs. And we did talk about in our working group that the current CCI might not be sufficient for things going forward. So whether CCI has to be expanded or a slightly new system out of it, then we just recognize that something along these lines needs to be there for all programs. And output restrictions. We would like devices to be able to output via any secure output to any secure device, whether this be a directly connected HDMI connection over HDCP or a suitable network connected device. Recordings should be exportable to any secure device, subject to copy control restrictions, so we would like devices to be able to move around as long as the copy control data allows so. And for the network transmission, if required for security, DTC/PIP outputs should be supported like is currently supported as a secure link transmission protocol. To ease navigation, retail devices should be provided MVPD guide data for the MVPD service for at least the subsequent 7 days. Guide data for VOD and PPV should be supplied by the MVP for all retail devices across all services, barring contractual limitations preventing some MVPDs from providing all guide data. We would at least like a single agreed upon standardized format for delivering guide data to third-party devices in the case of an MVPD deciding they would like to provide ample guide data. The system will require EAS data and a unified way of receiving this EAS data from all MVPDs, and the security. Retail devices shall be supplied content secure by a uniform security method or CAS, or at the most a limited number of permutations. We'd also like to see a common reliance on security methods for the DCAS module itself. And along with that, we'd like to remain a man-machine interface to allow interaction and querying of data from the DCAS module for relaying to the end user certain pertinent data. For the terms, depending on how much technology ends up being a part of this, ideally everything would be available under FRAND licenses to make as least burdensome as possible. And it'd be preferable if a neutral organization was responsible for the initial certification of devices.
Brad, can you just define FRAND? Because I don't know everybody knows that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
So FRAND is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. So a non-burdensome requirement for the license itself. And then along with the neutral organization for the initial certification, to keep costs down, self-certification should be allowed for subsequent retesting and recertification. And then a very important part is portability. The device would optimally work very similar across all MVPDs across the country, so it should easily be portable across all MVPDs, and it should be user-friendly to activate. And should upstream or two-way communication be required, we would like limited restrictions to be placed on the source of the connection to keep down having something like a DOCSIS modem inside of every single device when the user might very well have an internet connection of some sort as is. And that's all of my requirements. Sorry for speeding through them, perhaps. If anyone has any questions.
Brad, I think part of what, in the context of the conversation you were talking about for portability, is not just a user being able to take their devices when they move, but the ability to have a user switch providers and not have all their consumer devices on the inside have to change, which is a real pain point with consumers today. Right?
Yes, ideally the system would work to where you could possibly have multiple MVPD subscriptions on a single device and be able to switch between them, similar to having both of them on one unit and not being required to have multiple units.
Well, Brad, I don't think that's exact. Is this on? Hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
I don't think that's exactly what I was getting at. Is that when you want to change providers, say you drop one MVPD and subscribe to another, the pain of having to replace receivers during that process is something that we should aim to avoid. That is, it sort of ties into what I was saying, that we need to have a system that lets boxes be portable from MVPD to MVPD.
Right. And that would include, in our conversation, that would include not just straight client devices, but also things like DVRs, right? So the issue about what the interface is that feeds the system, you want to not just be able to support user interface driven devices, but also things like DVRs that can be made available via a third party.
And as you all remember, we had quite a bit of discussion about an app-provided service versus a non-app provided service. An app service being something that if you launch a different app and it takes care of some of those issues. There was obviously some pushback on apps as well. So that we spent quite a bit of time on the committee or on the working group discussing that app environment.
And again, I think it's helpful to keep the concept of a local DVR in mind, right? An app environment doesn't lend itself really to having having a third party actually build a DVR as opposed just to being able to watch streaming programming.
Right. Okay, so moving on, two more topics. Next, where is John?
To your right.
Right here.
Oh, there you are. John Mikowski from MPAA will talk about content provider requirements, and then we'll go to Robin on security.
Thanks, Jay. And I'm going to mirror Jay's earlier comment that as the working group worked through these stakeholder-focused requirements, we really have not reconciled them. So you are going to hear things that seem like they're conflicting requirements from different groups. So from a content provider perspective, we really broke it down into four areas of focus. One was authentication, second was content protection, third was licensing agreements, and fourth was service disaggregation. So in terms of authentication, the system really needs to do the things that systems do today, which is do subscriber validation, device authentication, individual subscription validation, and ultimately service entitlement. And those four elements really make sure that an end user is authorized to get the services that are provided. Under content protection, again, the starting point for us is that the systems that we come up with here have to have at least meet the same level of content protection that systems do today. There's been a great deal of focus in the industry on content protection, and we don't want to see any decrease in the security due to a downloadable implementation. And that said, the system needs to be upgradable because, as we know, content protection is something that is always a moving target. When we look forward and look at where content is going, particularly with ultra-high definition, we think that the Movie Labs specification for enhanced content protection should be the reference model that's used for protecting content going forward. Under licensing agreements, Jay talked a bit about this. The licensing between content owners and MVPDs is a complex part of the ecosystem, and the system really has to support the technical requirements of those licenses. There are a great deal of terms and requirements that are negotiated between content owners and MVPDs around the technical solutions as part of the delivery, and things like sometimes content is licensed for that allows only in-home use and doesn't allow extension beyond the home. Other content may allow both in-home use and extension beyond the home. So content or licensing agreements like that need to be taken into place. And then ultimately the final piece for us was really a strong requirement for no disaggregation of service. So these are retail offerings. So these are agreements between content owners and distributors today that are retail offerings. So the important thing for us is that they remain a retail offering, that a third party can't disaggregate various pieces of the service that are licensed as a service, both by the content owner to the MVPD and by the MVPD from the content owner. That includes things like branding and advertising, and really the whole sense of this being a retail relationship rather than a wholesale relationship. And so that encompasses the content provider requirements. I'll be happy to take any questions.
If I may, I wanted to, since I hadn't had the benefit of a discussion, if you could describe a disaggregation issue just a little bit more. Does that mean no separate search? I can't suppress a channel that I subscribe to because I just hate it. What is the disaggregation besides the no resale and for more obvious pieces?
Right. Well, content is licensed as a service. That service might include video, it might include ancillary data, it might include advertising, all of those things that are packaged to be together. So disaggregation would be taking that package apart.
So within one channel, as opposed to if I subscribe to the enhanced Spanish tier, I have to render every single Spanish channel that might be part of that tier, as opposed to just disaggregating one channel so I don't suppress advertisements or whatever.
No, it could definitely be beyond a channel. It could be, for example, a guide service that is provided by an MVPD where there are requirements and licensing terms on how a content owner's brand, positioning, those sort of things are part of a packaged service. And that might be multi-channel. It might have, again, ancillary data, might have advertising, might have guide data with it.
If I could just give some other examples. For instance, relocating channels in our channel lineup is an example. Running ads, overlaying ads on top of the content that we provide. Transferring content to out of home when we don't have the rights for out of home. Running social media on top of the content. Not displaying brands these are all examples. So.
It's also true that we haven't really nailed down the definition of what a service or the service or services are, nor have we gotten to the point of having a clear definition of what disaggregation means and about which it applies. I think many of the things, it's not a surprise, I suppose, that Jay and I have disagreements. Many of the things Jay just mentioned about channel lineups and things like that are just, I completely understand how an operator might have agreed to channel numbers and channel lineups, but it's difficult to see how in a full-on retail environment where there's no telling whether a device has channel numbers at all, for example, or what the navigation mechanism is. I think that from a consumer perspective, we prefer to have the most open set of environment for devices to operate in, and that many of the sort of fundamental concepts, things like channel numbers, really may not flow through to a retail environment, and a lot of those sorts of restrictions that operators have agreed to may not make any sense in a retail place.
And I think one of the other things we did discuss was consumers like the choice of being able to block channels, both from a parental control perspective, and not just the ability to access the channel, but block its metadata. So, pornography, other sets of things. I don't think you're saying that you're opposed to consumers choosing to turn off access to programming or guide data. So it's not. I don't think you were meaning it.
No, I think from a consumer perspective, if it's consumers making the choices, just like they do today, in a cable plant, the parental controls, you can turn off, listing certain channels, listing certain guide data, but that's a consumer making that choice, not an intermediate party.
Obviously, the platform has to create the tools to do that. And so you could imagine retail devices that were sold to parents wanting to do certain sets of things and making those defaults be easy. But that would still be okay with your viewpoint.
If the consumer is making choices like they do today, yes.
We just call it adult.
Okay. We don't carry that on fiber, but that's a different topic.
So let's see. So lastly, Robin is going to talk about security as the fifth part of the groupings.
Thank you, Jay. Yes, we covered a few aspects, a few key aspects of security, which are reflected in our draft report. I also, less than a week ago, did a presentation on overlapping topics, let's say, to the other working group. That currently isn't reflected in this report, and I'd hope over the next weeks or days that we'd fix that. I'll try to keep to the agenda of what we've got in this existing draft. So the first thing we discussed, it's already been discussed this morning, is the concept of robustness as a definition, as a concept, that there's not, at least today, there's not one size fits all in terms of how secure or hard or robust a security system is. There's different levels and different price points, different commercial needs, and they often, but not always, map onto different resolutions of video and different windows of value. So typical breakpoints would be 480i, 480p, 720p, 1080i, 1080p, and 4K, and there's many examples of different content being available to different security devices depending on the resolution. In fact, I know there's many studio contracts right now that even have a breakpoint at 240p for mobile or open devices, actually, not even mobile devices. So we have to understand there's not one size fits all, both in the resolution dimension and the value of the content, which usually maps onto the resolution, but not always. There's another really fundamental areas of encryption. The core encryption cipher used is always a point of discussion. As time's moved on, longer key lengths have been deemed to be necessary. Today, 128-bit AES is almost, I think, globally accepted as an acceptable solution, both in key length from a point of view of brute force attack, but also somebody mentioned, I think Brad, on FRAND or RAND. It fits in that model too. In fact, it's better than that. It's free, so you can't beat free when it comes to something like a cipher. My computer's gone to sleep. 1 second here. So I think there's a move to a well-defined encryption cipher. The other relating to that, and this is an important part, there's a concept called key sharing or common encryption, or in the old days, still currently, Simulcrypt, either with a capital S or a small s, which all amounts to the same exact concept where the signal, the encrypted audio-video payload, and sometimes metadata too, can be unlocked with multiple DRM or conditional access systems with a very, very tiny overhead, so the signal itself is not duplicated. That provides a great deal of flexibility and can avoid lock-in from CE devices or from the system itself. By the way, the DRM companies and people using them, I mean, just to throw out one example, Netflix uses common encryption rather successfully, I would say, to reach multiple devices, but doesn't have to store and cache the same signals in duplication. Another area that we've really begun to look at is the area of certification of auditing, and I know that Ralph Brown here has done a heroic job of capturing some of the steps in that process, which is in the other working group. But it's on multiple levels. First of all, typically a conditional access company would certify devices that are secured by its products. That would be CE devices, because at least in the current business model, they hold the responsibility and the liability. Therefore, they want to make sure that is fulfilled properly. There's other levels of certification. Typically, studios will ask for a third-party audit, at least at some level. The report is not necessarily totally technical, but it will certify that the device is fit for the needs that it's supposed to fit. In other words, the level of robustness and the value of content. So there's at least two levels of auditing, and I believe some MVPDs also do their own audits because they don't want to be caught out by others telling them after the fact that their devices are not sufficiently secure. And now, lastly, I think here we get into the whole discussion and downloadability and some of the potential component parts of that. There's a key ladder and root of trust. I've mentioned this before, that the dog and the tail wagging the dog is going on here. The root of trust is perhaps the most important part by far. The key ladder is certainly a useful part of that, but we shouldn't forget the root of trust. Then there's the downloader itself, and that is a critical part, especially when we talk about renewability. Because if we have made a fatal mistake in the system, in any of these systems, we need to download or fix the problem. Now, here lies the conundrum. The downloader has to certify the replacement. The downloader has a very critical role to play in security. However, the downloader by its very nature is not downloadable. It presumably ships with the device at birth, or something that will close to the downloader ships. Now, we can have the absurd scheme having a downloader for the downloader for the downloader. That doesn't really get you very far. So we need to recognize that this is an Achilles heel on this system. In general, renewability is an area that we have to look carefully at. In the commercial conditional access world, there are undisclosed features which a single company can manage to withhold and keep to themselves. Those features are invoked at the time when something really nasty happens. They're not part of a standard for some very obvious reasons, and they may save the device, the $100, $200 set-top box, for another 5 years or more. And this is not just swapping a smart card. There may be other things going on inside the system on a chip. So we need to look at that. And sort of related to that, we need to make sure we can innovate in the future. If we stick with a single, let's just say a root of trust or a single downloader, we may be locked into something forever, and it may just manage to get by, or it may not. And then there's a I think lastly here, or almost lastly, there's a term on software security. And hardware security. I think we need to recognize, and I did a little more on this on the Working Group 2 presentation, that there's both hardware and software are required. Both have to be secure to a known degree. There's no such thing as an abstract software. It runs on something called hardware. And these days, all hardware security devices run something called software. So we better recognize that, and it's the degree of robustness on each of those two and how they're tied together that we need to focus on. And then one final point was, I personally had a hard time with the definition that we used very loosely and very ambiguously, and I could tell it was getting misunderstood, called black box. And there's several reasons for that. One is it's a very vague descriptive term. The other reason, it has some very specific definitions in the security world. There's black box and white box cryptography, which have got nothing whatsoever to do with where I think some of the definitions were used. So I may back down a bit and say I actually wanted to ban the phrase, but if we do continue to use that phrase, then let's have it defined in at least a paragraph and stick to that definition, because it's a very horribly ambiguous term to use in the security group. Thank you, Jay.
This is Joe. If I can say something on that last comment. Robin did bring that up and had a valid point about maybe clarifying that definition of black box, because it's used in different terminology. I found the Wikipedia definition to be most useful here, and I'm going to see if other people would agree with that, because I believe that's what Allison was going towards and bringing that up in the first one. So per Wikipedia, a black box is a device, system, or object which can be viewed in terms of its inputs and outputs or transfer characteristics without any knowledge of its internal workings. And I think that applies, again, in your definition, whether that's a downloadable software element, which is a black box to someone like TiVo that makes a device and downloads software that we don't know about, or it's a physical device like some of the gateways demonstrations we saw in Working Group 2 that have an input from an LMB antenna. We don't know what goes on inside, but it has a nice IP-based output. So I propose that definition, if staff agrees, is one that I think you were going towards, and is not one about cryptology, black hat, white hat, whatever, are specific to that field, but more in the general term.
So Joe, I realize you weren't in our working group. There was a really strong reaction in the working group. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily like we voted and it was universal, but there was quite a few voices. So I think we can get all our work done without using the phrase at all. I think that was the point. And if it's polarizing, why use it? So let's see if we can get by without using the term. I think that's the main sentiment. So,
but I think we could probably do the work without saying those two words in order, black box. But I think we probably do need to maintain the concept of a thing, whether it's black or not, because it may be useful in sort of describing the problem and how things work. So, I think that I understand Robin's issue with conflating a term of art in the security world, black box and white box and other things, but the engineering term black box seems fine, and if maybe we should call it Allison's box or something. But I mean, the concept needs to stick around, whatever we call it.
So this brought up a wider issue of nomenclature. We talked about some terms that we were using that we actually are going to probably have a little glossary of a couple terms that may get misunderstood, and then maybe help some of the non-technical folks understand what we're talking about as well. I think in the same vein, I think we talked about this. Simulcrypt may be a term we want to avoid using too, because I've seen it used in multiple different ways. And
yeah,
it's
there's
confusing.
one with an S and one with a capital S, and some people think one means a specific version. So yeah, I think
that alone, I think, rules out.
You're right.
rules the word
right.
out.
So it's be key sharing or common encryption or something like that we should work on.
So Jay, in working group 2, kind of settle on using the app word, using the black box word, that seemed to characterize what you were talking about more clearly. Again, this is Joe. That's definitely not.
Yeah, I mean, from an engineering perspective, apps and black boxes are not the same at all. I mean, I don't think anybody in computer science would see those as being similar, or so I think that is probably less than helpful, just for me, because we have really two audiences that I'm worried about, namely non-technical audience in the sense it needs to be understandable, and engineering audiences shouldn't be confused, because one of my experiences being here is that in this building, there's sometimes a tendency to use terms that have a defined technical meaning outside the building in subtly different ways, which I suspect keeps a lot of lawyers in fees because they do the translation, but it doesn't always help our mission. So I'd like, to the extent possible, avoid kind of creating terms of art that nobody outside the building understands.
So before we move on, because I do want to get comments from, if there are any from the wider DSTAC committee. Sorry to put you guys on point, but I didn't hear anything from Matt or from Brent. I know you weren't assigned a speaking role here, but if you guys have anything else to add before I...
Sorry, Jay, but before moving on, I'm open to opaque box as an alternative to black box. Because, again, that goes exactly to what you said. It might have different meanings, so we can change black to opaque, but it still has the same inputs and outputs as defined by staff.
Joe, I'm a little confused on that one. Defining inputs and outputs and what apps actually are. Apps are downloadable software that gets loaded on a piece of equipment that does a function. And whether that function be a user interface, a VOD interface, it's not a black box. It's an app.
That's why I was trying to make sure that we distinguish between an engineering concept that has a defined set of inputs and outputs and functionality, and which could, in theory, include user-provided inputs, certainly, and the concept of an app, which, at least in my informal version, I'm sure Wikipedia has a definition of that as well, is a downloadable, a specific piece of software that you obtain from an app store, for example, or other software repository. So that is an implementation of that. So an opaque box could have multiple completely independent implementations that may well be, quote, apps in the sense that they're downloadable, installable pieces of software, but it is not an app does not define in itself an opaque box, and an opaque box does not map one-to-one, as far as I understand it, in common engineering knowledge and terminology, to an app. So they're related in the sense they both involve functions, but they're not, they work at a different level of abstraction.
If I can follow up, as you said, I think you're arguing in agreement with us that app is not an opaque box. It's more of a Roach Motel that there's an input, but there's no outputs. There's no way to record. There's no way to add on top of it. There's no way to put advertising. John, I know you have a comment about roaches, but but sorry, that's why I was confused, Bob. I think you were agreeing with us that, an app is not an opaque box because it lacks the output definitions.
I want to make sure.
John, let John.
Sorry. Go ahead, John.
So, yeah, in terms of the Roach Motel, one of the features that Dish has offered to its customers started out as a standalone app and has now been integrated into the overall Dish Anywhere app, and that is the idea that, and this touches on one of Brad's requirements. It doesn't necessarily meet it, but it's similar to it, and that is the idea that if I have a tablet, Android or iOS or phone, etc., and there's a recording on my Dish Network DVR, and I want to take that recording with me and watch it on the plane, or watch it in the car, or watch it just outside the house, or just inside the door, wherever I want to watch that. That feature, which has been called Hopper Transfer, is enabled by that app. Once the app is invoked, that recording is actually transferred to and under the control of that device. So the customer then is able to watch it, they can delete it. If they have another device which has a similar kind of security implementation, supports similar kind of DRM, they can transfer that recording to that secondary device, obviously not making clones and copies of it and respecting the copyright, etc. So there are, in fact, I think, beginning to be apps out there that support some of these models. I agree 100% that the generic or the first generation app model doesn't support lots of these features that we're starting to hear are strong requirements. That doesn't mean we're stuck. It may mean that one of the things the DStack is going to need to investigate is what are the requirements to make these things more useful to customers. We may have missed something. It may be that it's important to translate to a new language using something interesting like an online translator as a part of the process. I don't know. Certainly we have our vision of what apps are, and some of those features that you're talking about, Joe, are starting to show up in them. Not all of them. There may be ways for apps to talk to each other. Those kinds of more advanced architectures seem to start to be supported over time. So I take issue with the Roach Motel content checks in and it never checks out for two reasons. One, if the customer wants the content on a device, right now an app is the way I can get it there. I need some way to invoke a DRM and securely to transfer the content there, and I can't. Unfortunately, there isn't it's not a system service available to me on most tablets and today. If there was a system service I could check content into, wouldn't need a separate app. It could be part of the OS.
And just to respond to
well,
that.
And then secondly is I hope we're not stuck with what's deployed right now. I'd like to look at current and future trends and figure out maybe there are ways forwards here. I don't know.
If I can, I'm a little confused that because the opaque box that's in place today, the cable card, has the outputs which allow even more of what you had described. Through a TiVo multi-room solution, I get all those features you talked about. More importantly, if I switch operators, I get to keep all those features. Whereas the Roach Motel and its subsidiaries, which is the platform you described, you could take away something to the iOS at any time. Or as we saw for some operators that were using Microsoft software base, there was no option for iOS. So I think it's important that the outputs remain, that we have consumer choice for all those features you talked about, which were innovated because there was an output to the opaque box.
I think we agree on that. We need to figure out what to do. So we're in violent agreement there.
Thanks. Well, quick cut in to say we'll take a 5-minute break in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Probably.
Yeah. Can I just? We can come back to this. I don't want to dismiss it totally. But I did want to ask the other two members if you guys had anything you wanted to add before we open it up broader. So.
Yeah. It's going through the sessions I thought were extremely helpful, but as someone who's looking at this perhaps a bit from the business side and hearing about commercial requirements and some of the discussion we just had, I think we have to be conscious that often commercial requirements are driven by the paradigm of the time. Right? So references, for example, to where you are in the channel lineup are based on a view that there was this thing called channel lineups. And now, when there's app stores, there's commercial discussions about where you appear in the App Store. And in the next iteration, there'll be some commercial discussion about something else. So I think we should be careful there are certain mandatory commercial requirements that I think we've all discussed, but we also should be careful about understanding that some of these commercial requirements are just going to change. And we shouldn't let them sort of dictate the tune so much, or at least abstract the idea of placement, discovery, retention, I think is one part. But otherwise, it's been useful for me, but I do, I think a couple comments are coming on. This definition of service, I think we need to get at as we go forward. from where we look at it, sort of there's OSs, there's a series of services that are exposed to third parties, and there's third-party services. And we need to be very careful when we conflate those all together. That kind of bundling, I think, has generally been seen as not overly helpful.
And I think that's John's comment about, the current and future trends, and we need to be cognizant of that for sure. So, Brent?
Yeah, just a couple of comments again on...
I guess we shall do name and rank and serial number. Sorry, we're not all obliging by that like we should. So, sorry.
Brent, evolution. I think, again, these working groups are useful in getting sort of rising to the surface. What are the fundamental issues that we need to address? We're skirting around some of the other key components. I mean, definition of service, I think, as Matt said. And then here we are fixated with the color of a definition. I'm actually more concerned about the other word, which is box, because the box itself has, implications from a hardware standpoint. I mean, we talked about it, is it a virtual box or a physical box for this? Well, it's going to have to be something. So when we talk about this going forward, I think we have to get to that point, because we're a supplier of hardware, and if that hardware needs to have another piece of hardware to tie to it to get all of these ubiquitous, well-meaning but complicated attempts to move a box from a satellite operator to a cable operator to a telco, these are critical elements. And I'm not so sure box is really something that we should use. Forget the Benetton of colors that we could also choose from. Should we?
Okay. Yeah.
I'm Adan Sari with AT&T, and my comment was regarding the black box. Do we call this a black box? You mentioned that Microsoft doesn't work on iOS. We have a UVerse app on this device, and I can watch TV on this device. It does have an output. The output is what I'm watching, so it's not a cable, but it does have an output. So I want to make sure we're clear on that.
And if I may, just to try to attempt to calm this down just a little bit right before our break, the purpose of the box, exactly as Dr. Weber said, is to create this abstract concept so that we can be speaking in terms of inputs and outputs and capabilities, which I think is actually, in fact, what this working group has fundamentally done through this process. I think one reason why maybe some of the other terms people may be bristling against, such as app, is that it presupposes an implementation. And I think the idea behind black box thought is that you're not thinking in terms of implementation. We're not talking about boxes in the physical sense and a piece of hardware. We're not talking about anything kind of specific. The idea is to simply speak in terms of requirements. And I think that is fundamentally what this group has done, whether or not they've embraced the term.
Can I agree with that definition? If it's not a physical device, that's fine.
So before we go to break, Mark has been trying to say something for the last 20 minutes.
John did a better job than I would have explaining, because I think you're right. I mean, apps can eventually record. I would say I think John's members would hate to have their product thought of as roaches, but anyhow. One of the things that struck me as I was listening, two things that I'd like to comment on. I don't need answers. When we talk about the consumer needs, and I think Adam did a good job of phrasing those. I think the whole group did a good job of collecting those. But, I think, once again, current and future trends in consumer needs are something we have to really, really look hard at. And I hope we're using maybe research or some basis for these consumer needs, not just, kind of older thoughts. The other thing I was struck with, because I heard it a couple times, choice in the market is really, really important. And I don't think we'd all agree with that. I mean, choice in the market is really, really important. If you go back to when some of the requirements we're actually talking about were put in place, there wasn't as much choice in the market. I mean, right now, most markets we have 4 other MVPDs we compete against, at least. No market doesn't have at least 3. And then when we think about consumer devices, like devices you can buy, I just kind of made a quick list. TiVo, Apple, Google, Roku, Microsoft, PlayStation, Samsung, and then I think the list could go on from there. There are devices that are out there. Not only that, there's Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, Viacom, HBO, Sling, Samsung, and that list goes on in terms of people that have apps and actually are now licensing content to put into those apps. So I guess what we're talking about is more consumer choice, really, when we talk about consumer choice. So I just wanted to make sure that was heard. Thank you.
Part of the question is this committee necessary in that context? I would prefer us not engaging in that debate. I don't think that's useful to building engineering
I'm not
solutions.
debating it. I just said I wanted to comment on it because they were used in the report.
Okay.
Why don't we take a 5-minute break?
5-minute break.
And we can finish up before lunch.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. You have.
To your next topic, but I'll ask it now. What is the goal of Workgroup 1? What do you expect to produce at the end? A single list of requirements that everybody's kumbaya with and it's all good? Or 5 different viewpoints? Has there been any discussion on Workgroup 1 on where you're going and what you want to get out at the end?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking staff that question.
Workgroup 1.
So there was some discussion about, to boil it down to its essence, we want to define the what before we start working on the how. That's it at the root. And I don't think it's any more complicated than that. So we're really, most of us are engineers. We think like engineers. And if anything, we engineers have learned it's requirements, because if we have bad requirements, garbage in, garbage out. So we want to nail requirements before we try to solve the development piece of the solution. So
what if you can't come to a single set of requirements?
I think we'll cross that road when we get to it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So
yeah, I think part of what we want to do is get everything out on the table, bucketize them, and then we can then compare them, the areas of conflict, with the scope of the committee and the macro direction that we're trying to accomplish, right? So, for example, if, just to put a point on it, right, if you, like current cable card, you have to support the ability for innovation in user interface. That resolves certain issues in the conflict. But at this point in time, we want to just get everybody's point of view down, bucketize them so we're flagged and recognized, and then go through a process of resolution after that. Right?
Okay. Yeah. I have a related question. Maybe this was a process question. What is the plan going forward for sharing the document from Workgroup 1? I note it's not being shared with Workgroup 2 at this point, I don't believe. Is there a plan? I think actually, especially as we go forward, it might be good to share it more frequently so that the groups are on the same page.
Yeah, these guys on my staff have not sent that. No, I have. Sorry, I sent out the latest draft at I think 11:30 last night, and so as soon as I can get on my keyboard, I will send it out at lunch, and that's just I haven't gotten to it yet. So
what's the plan going forward? To share a bit more frequently? I know we've been kind of pulling information together, but is there a plan to share it? Well, I know some of us are listening in on the Workgroup 1 to hear what's happening, etc. But the report out is very useful just to kind of condense it down.
In this case, and unless you want to get into the sausage making, this was sort of the natural demarc of when we brought this together, got it summarized. Short of that, I think you'll have to just listen in on the calls if you want to get more detail, because we're not going to put out a report every week or so. John?
Jay, when you say we're not going to put out a report, I don't expect you necessarily, but if staff can do that more frequently. John Kiefer on Workgroup 2 has been pretty good at, since I'm listening in Workgroup 2 pretty frequently, I've been getting reasonably frequent drafts out of Workgroup 2, certainly of the presentations that are made into Work Group 2. So I don't think there's any problem with sharing the report out of Work Group 1 other than the administrative, like Jay said, he's got a staff. My staff, I will try and task them to do it. But missing some of the infrastructure like a listserv or like a set of names, maybe there is something that staff could do to share things after every call, twice a week on alternate Thursdays. I don't know exactly what meets your needs, Alan.
Well, just the big items, presentations. If there's a new draft that's going around that looks reasonable, send it around, and that might be a good opportunity for staff and vice versa. We don't want it to cause extra work, but I think it would help the information flow, help understand where maybe the information already exists in other work groups. Sure. Just so that we're working together.
Well, we're doing minutes, so maybe it's no more complicated than that. Just sharing the minutes.
Right. And the draft with the minutes.
Right.
There may be some FACO requirements here too, and we'll check.
Oh, okay, that's a valid point.
Because this isn't a finished product.
Yeah.
So, sorry. Go ahead, Bryant.
Yeah. I guess it's working. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I heard actually Robin mentioned it. Is that there's probably no need to really have one set security solution. There could be different types of security approaches for different content. For example, you might have content that's just software. Robin did mention Keyladder. So Keyladder is an approach, but now there's trusted execution, SOCs, which is more or less a processor that's kind of built into the chip, and that could also be a pretty low cost and effective way to address the security. So and some of that may be required, let's say for Ultra HD content and so different types of content may require different approaches. And so I'm just making a comment on some of the different things that we've talked about. It would be preferable to have common reliance, though, too, on this to make sure everything works. I know in the past when we've worked on projects, if the service operator didn't actually get didn't need to use that feature. Perhaps it didn't, get properly executed, So I don't know if that was actually mentioned as a possible requirement. But on the, we probably would like, common reliance, whatever our solution is. There's on the topic of guides, I think the operator certainly has to be able to faithfully show their guide with the full set of features and whatnot. And then there may be a requirement, as was mentioned, that the guide can't be changed. On the other hand, we do want to enable third parties to be able to do independent guides. So I don't know if that means that maybe the restrictions regarding, for example, channel lineup. Are those restrictions, are those things that could go away, like with new licensing, contracts? Or can there be some metadata or whatnot that gets transferred to the third parties so that they also honor perhaps some of the same restrictions? I think if you're taking and I know that it could stifle, maybe innovation and whatnot, but perhaps there should be some restrictions in that area regarding the UI. Perhaps there were some restrictions that do carry forward. In the area I heard about, I was listening to, I don't know if it was Robin again, but it was Brad regarding CCI, that the CCI is not actually adequate, and it probably isn't. It is not. It's not actually isn't, and it could also be limiting to the content providers because they may not necessarily, let's say, want to have maybe certain content protected or even distributed. They may not be interested in where they lose control over content. So they control it really well in let's say in the set-top box, the gateway box, even some of the but then it goes on to the next device, and then maybe some of the controls on that other device really get lost. So there's really kind of an inadequacy actually in the copy protection regime as it is. I don't know if it means, I know, for example, DTCP is used a lot, and a lot of the CCI bits get transferred directly in, and all that, but I'm just pointing out a problem. I don't know exactly how it gets addressed, actually, but there needs, there's another thing. I know there was something about having valid outputs. For example, HDMI with HDCP. Well, HDCP is busted. It's actually busted. And so if I were a content provider, if I could, for example, if I could try to turn off that interface, because I know that it's been completely hacked. And so the problem is you have millions of devices, that actually deploy it. So now it's a business case. Am I going to release content to that? But I would like to, part of the CCI bits should be maybe controls on downstream devices. So you have more selectivity in outputs, more control on what actually where it goes, and then I would feel more comfortable. I think if I were a content guy, what's going to happen to the content? Where am I? Is it going to go on an interface that I can't turn off? So these are some aspects. Other things I actually haven't heard, but. On the other hand, if I know if I can renew content, I know that I'll be able to get content. So if I know that I can say, well, I have HDCP 2.0 and I can communicate that, I'll be able to get content maybe to my device. So in a way, it's if we safeguard the content, then we can keep it flowing. Yeah, ideally the third parties would get access to more services, but I think mainly it's linear content that's very tricky right now, and the pay-per-view and VOD. So I think that really is the concern, and I think it could be separated perhaps, but it's not. I know it's not going to be the full offering. However, when it does get separated, I think perhaps the branding of the operator should be maintained. There's a belief that when you, if you're pulling, let's say, a Comcast feed or something like that, you're not totally disaggregating the service. So I think the branding and perhaps some of the rules that we were talking about, for example, I think. It was John was talking about ads, for example, that may be part of the service. It shouldn't be allowable, for example, to be able to, let's say, put an ad over another ad or something like that, or because that was actually part of how you actually, subscribe to the service. There were ads, that were part of the service. And so, again, I don't know how that's actually addressed either, with the third-party people that are able to do anything they can. But it seems like there's some thing in between that we can do, possibly, where you still have some branding and some things that can be done to assure that the service, albeit maybe in a reduced state, could be done, and yet still address all the third parties. That's it for me.
So I think most of what you just said was wrestled with in one form or another over the course of the last couple of weeks in our working group. So those are all topics that, like I said, that we wrestled with, and what we'd like to do, we didn't really have quite enough time to wrap all this up by today's meeting, but we would like to, and we've started actually a little bit of a sort of a reconciliation process. We want to find areas where we have alignment. We want to find areas where some of the requirements contradict each other, and I think we'll talk a little bit here later on this afternoon probably about next steps on working groups, but we do feel like there's a couple more weeks of work we'd like to do to sort of, after we've now sort of got this out on the table, like Milo said, let's try and put this in the blender and see what we can come up with. So,
one more question for work group 1. Were there any discussions in regards to the relationship or requirements between the MVPDs and the device manufacturers in this new world?
Can you elaborate on a little more detail?
So, MVPDs bring the content to the home. And what's the relationship between another device maker to provide that service with their own device? Were there any discussions on how this relationship would work between MVPDs? Who owns the customer, basically?
Is this on? I mean,
Adam?
It seems pretty clear that the third party device needs to have access to their customer too. I don't think there ought to be sort of a customer that the third party device has to go through an MVPD in order to reach the customer that bought their stuff.
So
and I also don't think it's necessary for, I joke and speak for himself, but TiVo charges a monthly fee for their stuff, and that needn't and shouldn't go through the MVPD. TiVo's customers are the consumer, and the consumer also buys service from an MVPD. I don't think it needs to be any more complicated than that.
So what's the TiVo's relationship to an MVPD? Is there this is new to us because we haven't been really involved in that space. So what's TiVo's relationship in regards to a cable company, for example?
Well, let's ask TiVo.
I think this goes back to one of the statements I made in the first DSTAC, which is we have an existence proof of a lot of these answers, and that is in the cable card regime. It helps define where responsibilities of the content owner, of the distributor and of the retail device begins, what that relationship, both legal and technical, is. And again, anything we come up with in this group, I think, again, should point back to how did cable card do this, or what was set up so that we don't have to try to have the same debates and re-educate people. So there was clear definitions in terms of technology, of DFAST, in terms of robustness rules, that made it possible to have this independent relationship between a third party and all MVPDs that were part of the cable card rules. I think some of the satellite people might say that they're not part of that today. But I think, again, pointing back to cable card as the baseline existence proof, that we can replicate a lot of that in terms of that relationship, just as you discussed.
So there was a lot of resistance to that aspect of the direct reference to cable card. I think it's informative. I think it's a point of information to refer to for lack of anything else. But some of the folks on the working group who have never had cable card as part of their requirements, don't know anything about cable card, have spent several weeks getting educated on it, definitely repeatedly did not like using that as a reference point, and I'm sure John will chime in here. So, John.
So after a couple of weeks of education on cable card, you all got about 80% right, 20% wrong, and you missed 20%. So...
that's not a bad score.
That's not a bad score. No, it's 4 out of 5 is not bad. But those fifths that are missing are, well, it's what takes a company from being listed on the New York Stock Exchange to who wants to buy my shoes for $1. So all joking aside, there are parts of cable card that we should learn from, and there are things that regime sets up that we are beginning to appreciate, offer value to end consumers, to third-party device manufacturers, and touch directly on your question on what's the relationship between an MVPD and a third-party device manufacturer. But some of the things that are in the cable card standards, we are learning pay-per-view, for example. It's written down. There's an SCTE standard where I can read all the details of how that's supposed to work, and then I learn nobody ever built that. And to not have a pay-per-view system up and running and be able to point at it and say that's how it works and it does work is a critical miss for a DBS operator. That's a part of our critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to try and get more on point to your question, we did briefly touch on certification processes, which I think is where you were going in this in the question, right? So I think one of the challenges is for a device to be really portable, right, which is clearly what the retail guys and consumer electronics industry needs to have happen. They don't want to have to go through 5 versions of devices for every different operator type, and then another 20 versions for every different operator in each type. We can't have a regime where an operator certifies every device. So I think something along the lines, what we discussed, something along the lines of what DTLA does with DTCP, that's not done by an operator. It's a relatively straightforward certification criteria with minimal cost. I'm not saying we use that, but something along those lines would, I think, be useful in this kind of context so that we don't get into specific certification requirements on an operator-by-operator basis, because otherwise it's just not going to be practical for any CE guy to go build. I don't know if you want to add to that, Brad. Well, or add.
I'm sorry. I mean, not directly onto that, but I think that with respect to using cable card as a yardstick, I mean, I think that it shouldn't be a surprise that cable card was at least imperfect in design and imperfect in execution. But whatever we come up with here certainly should not be less flexible and less capable than what that was. So I think that it's no matter whether you think whether cable card applied to your industry or whether you think that cable card got it right or wrong, it's useful to look at what it enables, things like TiVos, and make damn sure that what we do come up with is no more restrictive, certainly, than that.
Sure.
It does go back to the fact that cable card was done 10, 12 years ago. A lot has changed. As a blanket statement, that may sound fine, but there's a lot that's changed, and I do think we have to take, the trends that are in place right now into account to say, does that still work? And I'm not going to belabor the issue. I get your point. I get why there's a natural tendency to want to look at cable card because it's the closest model that we all know. I just did want to make the point that it hasn't applied to all the MVPDs, and so we have to be a little cautious about that. So as the next steps, as I was going into, our plan is to do some reconciliation. We've already started that. We'll talk about time, I think, later this afternoon, and see, if we can. Certainly, I think there are some areas of alignment, and so let's highlight those and put those on the board, and then work with the things that contradict each other, identify them. Talk about them in our working group, probably bring them back to the full DSAC. So,
do you have an estimate of how much more time you're going to need?
Didn't we felt like 2 weeks was probably enough.
2 weeks, I think, is what we both thought.
Okay.
Right. So.
Right. We'll talk about that later in the afternoon after working group 2 presents.
Okay. We're trying to wrap, John, but go ahead.
Well, I want 2 weeks. I don't disagree with 2 weeks, given what we believe we have on our plate at the moment. After we're done talking this afternoon, I'm concerned that, and by the way, while you're doing it, analyze these 2 small issues as well, and then 2 weeks is not enough time.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay, great. That'd be fine. But yeah, I don't disagree with 2 weeks.
Okay.
Good. Then I guess we're done until.
Yeah.
Good job. You guys have worked really, really hard, and you've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time.
Thanks.
And I know how many hours you're spending. I can't keep up with all the conference calls. So why don't we go to lunch, and we'll come back at 1:15, and we'll start with Working Group 2. You guys are ready to go?
Yes.
Okay.
We're ready.
Floor.
Good afternoon. It's Bob Klein from Cablevision. And I'd like to start with what the project assignment was to Working Group 2, was to report on each of the distribution architect systems in place today and define some of the differences of the commercial requirements and the threats and how to be met. The report is partly done, and I'll highlight some of the points we're at today. There are some differences in opinion, but we're working those out quite rapidly. We'll start with going through what I believe to be the different types of cable systems today. You have the traditional MSOs, the satellite, AT&T UVerse, Verizon, and the differences in their types of systems, even the differences between the existing cable systems today. So the cable systems, and I'm going to try to refrain from using acronyms as much as I can. So if I do go off on one, let me know that you need an explanation.
This will be a test.
The cable systems uses a QAM modulated system today over a hybrid fiber coax, which is referred to as the HFC networks. Uses an MPEG-2 transport stream, and in that transport stream can be different types of encoding. It could be MPEG-2, it could be MPEG-4, HEVCs, can have a different variety of types of video streams in it. The big differences is actually in the CAS, the control systems, the video codecs that are used, the core chips for doing deciphering, advanced system information such as the network configurations, system management. Each cable company uses it in a different fashion today. The operating systems that we use are not all the same. Some systems will use one type of an operating system, another one will use a different. Some cable companies have two different operating systems running in their plants at the same time. And basically the billing systems and the applications that are run on each plant are different. So that was the cable plants itself. Now, I'd like to just open it up to any of the group who have questions when we hit any one of these one topics, that we can, answer them at that time and then move on. Okay. The second is the satellite. The difference is, of course, the satellites are in different orbits, and the piece of equipment that's on the homes, the ODUs, which stands for the outdoor units that sit on the person's house, have to be faced in different directions. They use low noise bandwidth, LBNs, which actually take the network down and put it into the home. They use what they call a multiplexer to switch between which feed they look at. So they can look at one LBN or two LBNs or whatever they need to look at to get the proper signal in. And one of the most important things about satellite is that it's only a one-way, I say only, let me rephrase that, John. It is a one-way system. Okay.
The roaches go in.
So that being said, that covers most of what I have on the satellite. John, you want to add anything that I may have missed? Or
no, although for the folks captioning this, it's actually LNB, low noise block.
Okay.
Only correction.
AT&T UVerse uses an internet protocol over copper VSL and fiber to the home or to the premise. It uses a multicast for the live streaming, and multicast meaning all the streams come down, and a unicast for VOD, which means for each stream that a customer wants, he gets an individual stream sent to him. That's the unicast. Verizon Fios system is a hybrid of QAM and IP. It emulates for a downstream the linear program over a wavelength of fiber that looks very similar to the cable plant today. And for the upstream, there's no RF plant to send it back up, so they use an IP stream to come back upstream. Talk back. We've collected a variety of different conditional access techniques, the chipsets we've looked at, transport, control, and the video codecs. So these are things that in the cable plants today that we've looked at in kind of depth to try to determine the differences between the systems. And they are quite different. I'll open it up. Does anybody have something they want to add to the cable plants today? No. Yes, John.
So I was a invited expert in Workgroup 2, and I want to make sure I'm correct, and if not, to be correct. On the AT&T system, you actually are using a DRM system to control access, not a CAS. Is that
correct? Just one more correction or addition. For live linear, we do use multicast, but there's also a unicast part to that for channel change. When we change channel, there's a unicast part to it, so it's a little bit more complicated than just a multicast join. And we do use a DRM for our set-top boxes. So the way we see it, it's an application that runs on a set-top box, the IPTV Media Room application. And it uses the Media Room DRM, which was a precursor to the Play-Ready DRM. And then for other devices, these mobile devices and other devices, we use Play-Ready DRM.
Thank you. I believe, just to clarify something, the reason you use a unicast and a multicast is for the fast channel change?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. CAS systems turn video systems on and off, but there are many other threats to the cable. Let me rephrase. We're going to go into threats now. Cable systems turns video on and off, but there are many other threats that the providers have to address today. Circumventing the content licensing, where somebody actually gets in and proves himself to watch something that he's not entitled to. Video distribution. Assembling of collection of licenses and commercial content through individually negotiated copyright licenses with the content providers. There have been threats to the chain of trust model that assures security flow of the content from the content supplier to the distributor to the home. We have to be sure that from the time we receive it from the provider, that it's secure all the way through our networks, how it gets distributed out to all of our distribution points within a cable network, and how it actually gets to the subscriber themselves, that it's kept secure all the way. Other threats that we've had is the service itself, where we've had people break into networks and disturb our flow of content. Failure to render the service is one of the big ones we have. Failure to support the billing systems have occurred, and making sure that the threats to the advertising are kept at bay as much as we can. Okay, there's been a few different points on that all of the restrictions and requirements the cable operators must enforce are at their own equipment, do not apply to third party, either rental navigation devices or whatever. Content providers and MVPDs think that when the content and the service is handed off to a device, that device must handle the content with the licensing terms to be contained with the owner of the MVPD. Same, we're looking at to make sure that the same licensings that we have signed off, that if we hand something off, are applied to that secondary device. Joe?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And again, it hasn't been clear that Bob, like with Jay, there's a lot of information that was presented that is, very useful in terms of the differences between the plants and others. So behind Bob's comments, there's pages of stuff that's going to be very good reading. As you noted, there's a lot of similarities in terms of what we saw in terms of the early discussion with Working Group 1 and Working Group 2, and Bob has paused on this one. It's this concept of, what entitles the service and what must be passed on to a retail device. And I think it goes back to the discussion we had earlier, both about looking at the cable card as one way of helping resolve that problem, because it did define which aspects of a content owner's contract with an operator did not apply to a retail device. And to Dr. Ansari's question of, well, how do you find that boundary? And again, I could point to cable card not as the perfect example, but something we could start with and improve upon as a way that gives legal and other protection. I think the term used by Mr. McCloskey was quite good, and I apologize for not remembering where to look it up. But the disaggregation question, that again, you have this, operators have made agreements where there's not a disaggregation perhaps with the content owners, that those should not necessarily apply to a third-party device, which should have the freedom to not be bound by this. So if I can, a good example that came up, TiVo was one of the first devices with a recommendation engine, that if you like this television show, we offer across all the content choices, I can recommend for you this other one. If you like Game of Thrones, you might like House of Cards. Whereas for an operator's application or device, they might have a restriction, and we've seen these from content owners for their own devices. If you like House of Cards, you're not allowed to recommend a competing service's content. And so we'd like to know that if that's an obligation that a distributor has engaged in or entered into, that should not apply to a third-party device, where consumers should have that freedom they enjoy today of not being constrained by a particular content owner putting obligations on a recommendation engine or an advertisement. So perhaps longer wind, but I appreciate for Bob bringing up that point. That's another element that we saw within the Working Group 2 that was of interest, and it was similar, I think, to what we saw in Working Group 1.
Okay. So again, this is one of the points we brought up in the committee. We have not resolved yet, but we're going to continue working on. Rapid changes in the industry. We've collected how multi-channel services have evolved over time to be far more than just the delivery of linear and VOD programs, and how applications and feature updates today are occurring multiple times a month. MVPDs update their systems constantly. I'm sure other providers do the same. This is an ongoing, it's an increasing amount of network capacity that has to be put into play at a rapid pace, and it affects branding as well. Okay. I'm going to go to the app model. We've also investigated the app model, which is the most successful model to date for getting MVPDs and over-the-top video customers on their own devices. I can speak for my company. We have over 500 channels that are being able to play out on an iPad, on a PC, Android, or OS, on an iOS device, Apple. We do this with using DRMs on that particular platforms, and there's basically two apps we have to write to today. It's one for the Android and one for the iOS, and it's been very successful. I believe the number is about 52 million apps have been downloaded to devices so far, and it seems to be very successful in the network today.
Bob?
Yes, Joe.
So I think as you noted, so that one, the idea of the app model, again, presented and included in the report, also was highlighted again, I think, in Working Group 1 as this concept of, and I will retract the idea of roach motel. I think it would be more like a safety deposit box in a sense, because the content from the MPA is so valuable. But either way, it's hard to get it out. And so, as we heard from Mr. Goldberg, from representatives from Vizio and others, that the idea of giving users the freedom to take that content and within copy control bounds and encoding rules, whatever it is, again, established, being able to do more than only what the MVPD's app dictates. Again, whether it's the being able to search across content that they don't offer, to make recommendations that their content owners don't necessarily want made, again, things beyond the application model. So as Bob said, there's no disagreement. App model is, developing, and operators, and I think Brad had said very well, there should be an option, though. I can take the app, or I might have a super app, something else that once I get access to content, a third party can innovate and develop on.
Who's running the queue here? Okay. Well, then I'll go. Then I'll open my mouth and go. So, Bob, one of the things you said is very successful, or the most successful to date, in 50 some odd million people. But I wonder, successful at what though? I mean, I think that providing, if an operator provides their interface to their service on a consumer's device that isn't much more than a handheld display and has no real opportunity to do anything else. I'm sure the app is successful, but I don't think that makes it successful at the sorts of goals that we're aiming at here, which are competition in navigation devices. Because I don't think that stuff, though it may be good for consumers, and maybe a lot of people like it, and it may be something that operators like to provide, I don't think it makes it a competitive navigation device.
I can answer that one.
Go ahead and answer first.
I'd like to answer that one. Our navigation devices today, what we download to our devices is the same user interface, look and feel, that we give to our subscribers over our regular cable plan. You can order a VOD for your home. You can do a downloadable app, or if you want to it. It is a full user interface. I can add a channel to my lineup if I choose to, which interfaces back into billing systems, into authorization systems. It is a full download of my exact, if I wish I had a copy of it here, I could show that a cable plan today, my user interface and my app interface are identical. We get all of the same.
So it's not competitive.
Well, it's when you say competitive, I'm looking at it as this is an app where we went out and we developed this for our customers because it was something that we thought the industry wanted. And the customers love it. And it shows by the amount of apps that have been downloaded today that it is taking off.
Narrow down the definitions a little bit, because I'm hearing at least two ways that the term app is being used. And there may be others, but namely one is an app written by the MVPD or its contractors in that, which is downloaded by a consumer to access functionality provided presumably by the MVPD. And then there's a separate one which is presumably somewhat closer to kind of the smartphone, at least the Android model, where you have third parties unaffiliated with the vendor, the content, or the hardware, or the service for that matter. So the cell company in the cell case provide an app that offers additional functionality. I'm just trying to make sure that when we talk about these things, this is kind of where I guess working with 1 and 2 start. It's both a business issue and a technical issue. I assume you are mostly talking about the first type of app, namely an app provided by the MVPD or its providers, suppliers made available to customers. Obviously, in more outside the cable world, if people talk about an app, they often talk about not just the apps provided by Apple or Google or Windows or Microsoft. We're talking about apps provided by third parties that are independent or maybe even competing with the provider of the platform. Is that, does that distinction make sense?
John, take that. So, Henning, I think you may be drawing a distinction in a place where it doesn't quite belong. So, for example, the app that is provided for use on iOS devices that Dish Network contracted with a third party to write is found in the Apple App Store alongside other apps that you can find, alarm clocks and all the other iOS things. So the distribution paths, I think, are likely to be identical for these apps. That may or may not matter. I think you do note a distinction between the two, and that is who is the authorizer or the generator of the app. And in the case of the Dish Anywhere app that interacts with Dish's service, some of the things that app guarantees are the contract relationships that Dish has reached with the providers. For example, expiration times for content or agreements not to distribute the app or not have it run on jailbroken devices, etc. I don't know today how to expose enough of that information, except, say, through a DRM, to a third-party app. I'm worried that we're designing some version of the Monty Python cheese shop experience where a third-party app shows up and says, I can show you all the content I've got, and every time a user queries what content can you show me, the answer is, well, I can't show you that content because X or Y. So the distinction between apps and who authorizes them is maybe more useful to look at what apps can stick to what terms. And to bring it back to Cable Card then, Cable Card gave a clean interface but a simplistic interface on the output of content from a system. The apps that are available today can do quite a bit more and respect more. Gosh, I've said some things.
I think Mark was first and then second.
I want to make sure that comment here about no competition. I think we got to really be careful of how we phrase stuff like that. iOS, Android, PlayStation, Samsung TV, Vizio TVs all provide platforms. The app world has embraced those platforms. There's more apps on those devices and more competition on those devices than any place else, number one. Number two, if I'm in Long Island, I'm not, but if I was one of Bob's customers, I could also be a Verizon customer and use the Verizon app. I could be a Dish customer and use the Dish app. I could be a DirecTV customer and use the DirecTV app. So to frame this as non-competitive is just factually incorrect, and I want to make sure that gets out there. So that's that.
Well, that's not what I was saying. But
I think you did say that.
Well, I mean, I used the word competition, but that's not what I was saying.
Oh, okay.
Well,
So, in fiber, we have apps as well. I think we view them as very different, though, for a couple reasons. The HD feeds that we distribute are typically 12 to 14 megabits per second. I'm unaware that most of the platforms, the tablet platforms, the mobile platforms, can decode data at that rate reliably in the native resolution that we send to the television. So part of the dynamic is, and the DRM platforms available on those devices are different in their ability to protect, particularly in some of those platforms where the underlying hardware is not natively accessible via the operating system. So the devices that talk to the television have a 10-foot interface, and they can deal with the TV in full native resolution, whereas we typically would send different resolution to mobile devices because they're really not capable on a universal basis of being able to render. The other dynamic where we don't think it's appropriate, or at least I think we have a pretty good rationale for not using the same UI, is that a 10-foot interface off a television controlled by remote control is a very different interface than what you would have with a touchscreen. And so having a common interface between both the 10-foot UI on the TV and that on a mobile device, which is a smaller screen, different sets of real estate, but does have a touchscreen digitizer, right? We think you can do a lot more with that, but forcing conformance between the two, we don't actually think that that's a good idea. But from a resolution perspective, the quality of the programming you get on a mobile device is not like what you get on a television.
Okay, I'd like to answer that one for you. Our streams today that go to the mobile devices are at a lower resolution, okay, because they don't need it on that device.
It's a different experience.
It's a different experience. Yeah. The streams we will be sending to the TV will be at a higher resolution, and the boxes that will be designed for those will be able to handle those higher resolutions as well as the resolutions for the interfaces themselves. So when I say they are identical, they're identical looking. They're not exactly the same stream going out for an interface for a TV as it is for a handheld device.
And that's changing today. If you look at the latest 4K TV from Samsung, that's running an RVU app. You can watch 4K TV running an app on a TV. So that's changing. It's no longer mobile devices. It's slowly shifting to TVs.
I don't disagree that the underlying hardware platform gets more capable, but one of the dynamics about apps in the kind of context that you're using it is that it works across a wide range of different devices. That will necessitate different resolutions and different transport formats because those devices don't have the same capability. And so I think it's a little misleading to think of an app on a mobile device as equivalent to something that drives a television at full native resolution. And I think, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And most of the televisions, that are out there today don't have SoCs, that can handle that. So there's a transition path as those devices age out. So you'll need to have some device that can deal with the native high-resolution format. And there's also the issue about audio, right? At least what we've seen is most of the apps that operate on iOS or Android platforms don't give you the same HD audio capabilities that we have in the going to a sound system off of a television or receiver being driven by HDMI. And so you don't want to have an environment where for the consumer to get a different kind of retail experience that they're shortchanged in both video quality or audio quality. And so I think that's one of the downsides about this approach.
But the environment is also shifting today, the way media is consumed. A lot of people are consuming media via mobile devices, and they're very happy with what they're getting. So it's
the issue is that they're not competitive, right? That is to say, mobile platform is an alternate distribution stream. There's a television interface as well. And so I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
People love mobile devices, but they're not the same as what you watch the Super Bowl on with your friends, right?
And you do have competition there already. There's not there's no monopoly. You can get okay, go ahead. Mark.
I guess
Sorry.
It sounds like I'm confused by your comments, and I hope that others might be as well. I mean, I think the point of the report was to mention that the app model in general has been embraced across the whole internet, many platforms, whether they're mobile or television. To talk about whether the resolutions are going to be one on the other, I'm not sure.
My main concern.
No, excuse me a sec.
Oh, sorry.
Netflix, for example, is on almost every television platform. They're the first to deliver 4K. They have the best resolution, the best audio, and by the way, they have an amazing UI. And a UI that I know that Joe has encapsulated in its entirety as an app on his TiVo box.
Though an Apple TV actually has a Apple-generated UI for Netflix.
But does
not
it
a Netflix-generated UI.
Does it look like Netflix?
Not like any other one.
Well, that might be a business deal they have.
No, but I'm just saying.
Okay, but the point is, you're obfuscating using, quality of video or sound. The provider, whether he's an over-the-top provider or an MVPD, will provide the right resolution, the right sound quality, the right mix of service to the right device. What the point is the app model has been embraced. And I think, you would know that more than anybody.
I don't disagree with that. My Audi has apps, but it's not a substitute for my TV.
My point is over.
Robin, you've had the hand up for a while, I'm sorry.
Sitting in Silicon Valley, surrounded 100 yards from my house by half a dozen very successful and not so successful app companies. And a lot of companies are trying to fix a bunch of app problems like deep linking and deep search because the customers are rather annoyed that they're stuck in a little silo. I heard this morning about Pandora being called as an app, but its UI not even been exposed. So we may think that the next 2 years, Nirvana is a bunch of apps. By the way, the kids are working to solve the problem they just created to get rid of all these silos. So I'd hate to imagine we rush into this great app world only to discover we're 5 years too late, and our customers actually want to look for metadata. And some of those companies are looking at this stuff, have given up on video because they say, oh, we can't get the guide data. It's all secret. Nobody will talk to us. So we're just going to do social search, restaurants, whatever, and tough on the users of those apps. They're just going to have to stick in a little silo. So I'm concerned that we're thinking that apps are just little silos when some apps, you don't even see them. They're called in the background. And they function and they pass it on. So I think at least one thing we should do is define a lot more carefully than we have now what is an app. I even heard some PC apps. Is that app or application? And they do actually talk to each other, and you can disaggregate content in many of them. So I think we better understand the app world so we don't go headlong onto an app world that's 5 years out of date by the time we get there.
Joe.
Okay, thanks. Joe at TiVo again. Commenting on what Mark had said, so it's true you can buy maybe a television, and if you subscribe to Cablevision, you get one choice in the Cablevision app. If you move and subscribe to Comcast, you have one choice. Luckily today, through CableCard, you actually have two choices. You have a TiVo application that runs on these same devices, gives you same access to linear content for Comcast as well. It gives you on demand. And it's that choice. Let's not take away that choice. Mark had said this is competition, and I would argue it's not competition if the only choice in app is one from your cable provider. And we want to maintain the fact that you can have competitive. So the fact that there's 20 apps on a TV, but you can only use one of them because you only subscribe to one cable operator at a time, is irrelevant in terms of competition. You want innovation on the user experience, cross apps. And I'm sorry, I'm old enough to remember the telephone company telling me you have a choice of telephones. They all came from us, but you couldn't buy some else third-party telephone. And so that's not choice.
Well, I mean, that's you're comparing cable companies, but don't forget we've got DirecTV companies and telephone companies and over-the-top providers.
And fiber, too.
And fiber
and
companies.
Thanks, Mike.
And Sony's now licensing content and selling it, and Apple's now licensing content and selling it. And so to say there's no choice is ludicrous. Okay.
In user experience is what I said, Mark. Not where you get content from, but in how you view that content.
Okay. John up, and then Jay next.
So, Joe, forgive my ignorance. At one point in time, maybe in the distant past, I think the owner of a TiVo was able to load their own software into a TiVo. Is that still a capability that you guys provide for your customers? They can load their own choice of UI and operating system and so forth? Or is that something that you guys have not been able to maintain going forwards?
As long as I've been, there's never been that case. The box has always been secure.
Okay, maybe my understanding was incorrect. I thought at one point you guys had a Linux operating system and folks could build their own version of TiVo?
No.
Okay, somebody else. Thanks. Jay?
I think that just two quick things. I think what Bob at first was, when you first introduced the topic, I think one of the things you were trying to embody is, in the old world, some of this content was locked up inside of cable boxes, and Apple had to sit on the sideline going, gosh darn it, I can't get this content on my devices or Android or whatever. That has obviously changed, and so I felt like that's what you were talking about in the first aspect. In regards to the app and the evolution of the apps, it is very important to call out what John's company is doing, what Sony has introduced, what Apple appears to be ready to introduce, which is linear content over the top through apps on lots of different devices. And that's what when we refer to the trends that are going right now, future and current and future trends, that's real. I think we're going to come back and talk a little bit about that from more work or more study, but that obviously landscape is changing really rapidly before our eyes, even over the course of the time that we've met over the last month. So.
And I still wanted to get back to, again, to make the report particularly helpful is to make sure, as we try to do during the first one, that we define our terms precisely. Again, the term app gets used in a fairly wide sense as a technical term, and as well as who writes it, who's authorized to do it, and so on. And maybe I'm somewhat surprised the analogy hasn't quite come up, because, and this is based on your remarks, is that we've seen a bit of a back and forth between, if you look at the underlying content, Facebook being a good example on that, namely where you have a browser model for the content, where you can obviously access Facebook through a browser, and you can use Chrome, you can use Mozilla, you can use Internet Explorer, you can use whatever else you have access to. And indeed, in that case, Facebook does not control the browser that you use to access its content, except by explicit prohibition. And then you have the app model, which is written by Facebook only. Nobody else can write a Facebook app, realistically. But you also have an app model which accesses content is provided by a third party, which is a very different model. Again, for example, an app that accesses public transit data or something like that, and through open APIs. So I think without specifying more precisely as to who can change what, that makes it more difficult to really distinguish the finer points of that there is not just one app model or one content access model, that we've seen now a number of different models. And I think it would be helpful, certainly for me, to see a little bit more differentiated discussion as opposed to the world is neatly divided into apps on the one side and something else, cable card, who knows what, on the other side, which I think isn't quite reflective of the internet ecosystem at the moment.
Sounds like an expanded version of my glossary idea.
Yes.
Yes, Bruce. What we've been trying to do is capture what's there today as opposed to talk about what is coming. I think we want to get to what is coming, what the different potential models are, and brainstorm around some of the potential commonality solutions.
Can you pull the microphone closer? Otherwise, you're mostly feedback.
Sorry. And we've struggled just to capture what is there today. So, hopefully over the next 2 weeks we can kind of put a bow on that piece and then spend more time talking about, what can be or what could be and what the permutations are here. So this morning, NFL announced they're going to market one of their games this season right over the top, direct over the top. So it changes every day.
The web app analogy, though, is a good one. It's another type of app, and it actually is being used right now with the DirecTV RVU service. It's using kind of HTML5, and there's ongoing work right now in DLNA with something called CVP2 VidiPath, which is HTML5. What's interesting about that is, as Henning was mentioning, it's basically many platforms. Whereas, if you look at the web app, how many platforms can a service operator actually support? Is it going to be iOS, Android? There might be, Samsung is big, so they're having, they have their OS. Perhaps you could make a special app, but it seems that the web, HTML5, especially where the operator is able to really render a very nice UI, if it be, or even a third party could render their own UI in a nice way, and so I think that should be an application that should be looked at as well, the browser app.
So again, Joe from TiVo, maybe can you save Bob some of his voice as well here. So I think Brent kind of stepped ahead. Bob will probably present, maybe I can save you that time. We got presentations in the working group on VidiPath, CVP2 as other models. There's a lot of good detail in the report around those. And so what was interesting, though, is the discussion, at least from my side, that like these apps approaches, at least for DLNA, CVP2, and especially for RVU, they are roach motels in the sense that the content can only be presented by the operator's HTML5, as you noted, and no outputs that go to a third-party representation. So again, that recurring theme kept coming up is that no one debates there's these app models, and no one debates there's technologies like that, but do they fit the paradigm of bringing up user interface innovation and third parties? And so as we found with both RVView and VidiPath that no, they are limited today. They can be changed, but today they don't allow a third-party user interface.
They do download onto the Samsung TV, to the LG TVs, to the other TVs out there today as the interface. Yes.
In your model of the app as this solution, how does a third party build a DVR in that model?
We at Cablevision have network DVR.
But what if a consumer would like not to be bound by limited storage, et cetera, et cetera?
Go ahead, Mark.
VidiPath that allows for recordings. So I've heard a lot of talk about apps not being able to allow the content to go to.
Well, that's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, it can work.
So what's the model?
As John said, the app model has to evolve some too. I think Henning made a good point. Where's the app model going? But content can be recorded.
Sorry, this is Joe Tiva. Just on that one, can that content be recorded by a third party's application? Mark?
It can be recorded on a third party's device, yes.
Device, not the third party application.
Well, the applications have to talk to each other probably. Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, Jay and Mark. This is the important distinction that we brought up several times. Can a TiVo app receive content and record it from a CVP2? And that's the question I asked from the presenter. It's my understanding that's not correct. You cannot record it from a TiVo application, only from the Comcast application or the Cablevision one.
One thing to point out, though, is the TiVo application can play back the recording that was made, however. So that recording that has been made is, once it's scheduled, once the whatever is done to make that recording come into existence, my understanding of VidiPath, which is not as, it strikes me you guys in Workgroup 2 might want somebody from VidiPath to come in and talk about the features of that. But my understanding is that, in fact, a TiVo app or anybody else's third-party device could then move that recording around, treat it as a consumer-enabled recording. I may be incorrect. I'm not going to put myself forward as a VidiPath expert.
Yeah, Joe, and I believe actually that is incorrect, that it's locked down to the app that recorded it. So.
Joe, what I would suggest is we'll put that on our working list.
Put it on the
working
list.
Group 2.
I wish I had the answer off the tip of my tongue. I know it can be recorded, but we'll have to look at it.
If it can, to be fair, we're only putting in the working group report that there was questions raised. Are those models? Yeah. We're not saying either way, and I just want to make sure that it's recorded in the working group report. that the questions were raised, that model doesn't enable a third-party user interface. It does allow devices, but not the user interface.
We'll certainly continue that in Working Group 2. My next one was VidiPath and RVU, but I think we've exhausted that one already. Oh, one of my favorite, cable cards. Cable cards were deployed to over 50 million lease boxes today. I believe there's about 620,000 retail devices that have them in there today. They were originally designed for UDP, which is a one-way linear cable service, but not serve the required interactivity, such as VOD. When they were designed, it was never designed to do VOD. So some people say cable card, and Joe's going to disagree with me or agree with me on this one, but that was 10 years ago. Okay, so today, the cable card is still a one-way device. Okay, it was designed to do one-way. We did do some adaptations with tuning adapters to be able to do switch video. When we had to a while back when that request came to us, we were able to go out and do tuning adapters. Some people, and I'm not going to say who, will say cable cards were a great success. Other people will say they were a failure because it didn't get to the next step that people wanted them to get to. Yes, Alan.
I mean, with respect, that's revisionist history. Cable card has two-way capability and has had from day one. The fact is, it was never enabled for various reasons, but it's not right to say that cable card has always been designed to be one-way only. It's not true.
I think it is true to say that the CE manufacturers in the beginning said all we want is one way, and that's what happened. We did attempt a way to do two-way using true two-way, and that, as we know, did not work out quite as well either. So we got to be careful how we revise history, I think.
If I can, I think Bob had a good point. The first one is that I don't think there's any debate about the technology, what cable card was, the interfaces. I think what came out is some debate about terms like this was a failure or this was a success. I think if we can leave those type of things out of the report, it would make it much, much easier. But when those things were introduced, that it became an issue.
I think part of the issue is the debate, and we have to resolve it in the committee, is cable card the starting point for both Working Group 1 and Working Group 2? And the world's changed, life's moved on, lots of things are different than it was a decade ago, and I think both groups have got to come up with a resolution on that. Even talking about this morning, someone's talking about how we're going to certify devices or certify the whole concept. I mean, 29 CE manufacturers came to the table with over 600 devices in the initial cable card world, and they were certified. To base something on something that has not really worked, and I think the fact that we're in this room is that. So I think that's what the debate is, not whether history's been revised or, how well it did or didn't work or why it did or didn't fail. I don't think we should ever get into that. I totally agree with. Let's keep it out of the reports. But the debate still is going to be is this the place where we start? Is that the baseline? And I think what we're saying is a lot of companies never adopted it, and the world's changed a lot, so it's not necessarily the place to start.
So one of the questions, again, trying to drill down a little bit, is when you say start, because we have really, from what I see, two aspects or I guess three aspects of the cable card in abstract terms. Namely, one is the embodiment, if you like, if you want to use patent language, as a specific device. And I suspect I would be surprised if anybody wants to replicate that particular aspect, PCMCIA and all. Or is it a hardware? And we've all heard that the distinction between hardware and software is a bit of a fuzzy one. The second one is the capabilities and model one, namely what could the thing do, what was its opaque box input, namely in outputs and capabilities and API, if you like, namely the control interfaces that they had. Was that a good model, even though you would not replicate a silvery little card that had a bunch of PCMCIA interface on one end? And thirdly, what, if any, process is necessary to ensure the integrity and other aspects of a system that presumably would differ depending on the embodiment. Presumably a software solution would have a different set of requirements than a hardware solution would, or some combination of the two would. And so I think the lessons that we can learn from that would be most helpful if we could disentangle, to the extent possible, those different aspects. Because we may disagree collectively around the table as to which aspects caused either the success or the failure of those, but we might be able to look more objectively at each one of those components and what, if any, lessons we can draw from those 3 or 4 different components, as opposed to cable card as a whole, because I don't think it's not within the purview to replicate cable card in black now, because we don't do silver anymore. So.
Yes, Milo. Bob, did you guys do any work on the DVB ecosystem? Because outside the U.S., we have DVB standards with standardized conditional access, and
Yes.
many of the CE vendors here produce products in that ecosystem.
We use the DVB standards at Cablevision.
No, but with the DVB-CI.
Not sure.
The conditional access.
So, Bob, I think we were trying to capture, for the most part, what's deployed today in the U.S.
Right.
We didn't spend a lot of time specifically on DVB and SumCrypt outside of what's deployed already today.
Yeah, because I think, going back to Henning's point, if you just look at the model, U.S. operators, North American operators, use proprietary crypto schemes. But the rest of the world generally uses the DVB family.
Right.
And today, both, I believe, Sony and Samsung ship TVs on a global basis, not in the North America market, but that have DVB-CI interfaces that if you plug a hard drive into them, they act as DVRs. It's exactly the kind of ecosystem that we would be talking about, right? John, you use DVB on the framing on the satellite, right? DVB-S2?
No, I absolutely. Dish, DirecTV uses DVB-S2.
Sorry,
Dish does not.
Sorry.
Once upon a time, Dish was a mostly DVB compliant system. We have diverged over time from that, in part due to scale. The DVB standards don't anticipate running 14 million households on a DVB architecture. There's bits and pieces. We could probably go to DVB and ask them to add all kinds of changes to their standards to make it actually work in the case of Dish's system, but at this point we would then be the only ones to use it were we to do so.
We make the CI modules and cable cards for that matter. It moved to CI Plus, which is like DFAST. It encrypts the output in the last several years. I wouldn't want to characterize it here on the success or failure, but let's just say they do ship considerably more into TVs. They're almost solely used for TV. Well, solely used. I think there was once a set-top box, but only once.
They're all built into devices.
They're slid into. They're not bolted in. Samsung, to give one example, actually ships them by default in the box, so that the user has a nicer experience. You have to consciously get rid of it, and on some markets, not all markets. So it's had a little more success in the TV side, let's just say, internationally.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to open it up to the floor. If Joe, you have raised your hand.
This is Joe again at TiVo. One comment. I want to thank Henning because I think it helped, at least for me, understand some of the differences between like Mark's comments about cable card and, as you said, it's not. I think it's a great model for the baseline, not for its embodiment in terms of the actual physical cable card, but the system ecosystem that it enabled. That 29 vendors with completely different engineering capabilities, were able to successfully license the technology, develop the technology, put products out, again, is a success in terms of that model, that it is possible to have a regulatory and technical model which allows almost anyone to create these devices. And that's the baseline I hope that we all agree is something we want to work on, not the physical embodiment of that card and how many watts it burns. So again, to Mark's question, again, I think that is a success, and that's because I see it less as cable card, but a model which anyone could have built, and they did build these products.
All right. Except they all then left the market. But I hear you. I'll give you that. One addition to, I think we kind of ran by VidiPath, and I totally 100% agree we should have them come in and present so we get all the facts right. But I think it's one thing it's important to note is that the VidiPath effort is a joint CE and MVPD effort. There's over 150 different companies involved, many CE companies, many MVPDs, many companies that surround that in terms of building products and technology. So it's I think the FCC's actually embraced it to a certain extent or said it was a good thing, or I'm not sure. I might be wrong about that. But anyhow, just wanted to make sure that I think that's in the report, but I wanted to make that point.
Does anybody else have comments or? That completes my report. We've made a lot of progress. We have more work to do, and we will require some more time to try to finish. Joe, you agree with that?
Yeah, thank you. So I just said there's a lot of, this is again Joe at TiVo, a lot of good stuff in there, a bunch of detail on VidiPath, and maybe we can follow up. I just saw a lot of nice common themes. I guess not surprisingly, some of the exact same arguments were in Working Group 1 and Working Group 2. I don't know, there's another section, Bob, there on the DCAS solutions from Charter and Cablevision today. And so one of the things that I think we learned that was, to me, quite surprising is that devices on Charter's plant do not work on Cablevision's and vice versa.
No. It's in some of Charter's area, okay, the Cablevision box will not work where there happens to be an ARIS security system. Any box will work in the Charter system, in their PowerKey system, or in their NDS system. Any box from Charter will work in Cablevision. The difference is, and without getting into too much detail, in the SOC, there's a special code that was added for Charter so that they could use the ARIS encryption. And that's the only difference between the two systems. Jay?
So this is Jay from Charter. So maybe I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but you had a predominantly or all Cisco-based system when you did the exercise, so you solved for that. No discredit and absolute pioneering work. We had to solve even a harder problem, which was solve what Cablevision solved and solve it for the other half of our conditional access systems, which was the former Motorola MediaCipher. And so we tackled the whole thing, and our boxes can move around, when they launch, which is soon, but they can move around between those two conditional access systems, and thus can move over and work fine in a Cablevision system. So. Okay, so this is Joe. So it works one way, but not the other way. It's really it's a time thing. It's a date thing. They solved one way. We solved a broader thing. I think you were trying to solve your own problem at Cablevision, right? And that would have been very, very bold to go and solve that whole thing just because of maybe something that might happen in the future. I don't. Yeah. So.
All of our systems were PowerKey, and it was up to us to switch them over to the new NDS platform. We didn't have a need to go after MediaCipher and do that one because we didn't have any in our plant. Jada has that in their plant, so they had to add that piece to the SOC. In the future, if we were to buy more boxes that have that added piece to it, we probably would.
Could you explain what you mean, add a piece to the SOC?
It's a software piece that was added to the SOC.
Keying material, or?
Jay, maybe you
It's actually, I'm happy to have that conversation behind closed doors, but for security purposes, I really don't want, this, believe me, I had to, triple dare, promise to keep some of these things a little confidential so we don't reveal weaknesses of any kind, so.
So Jay, with this new architecture and implementation, you're now able to change that security keying technology. You could move from one to another, et cetera. Yes. You're not locked into a particular CAS architecture at this point.
No. This is sort of at the base level. This is really, we're able to add a CAS on top of that can leverage what's in the SOC to be able to do this. And it's not so secret that not everybody could implement it, but it is a commercial arrangement.
Right. This has to go to the proprietary nature of the crypto.
Yes, you can talk to the gentleman from Georgia down there. So.
Which, of course, has been there for 20 years.
Right.
Trying to solve something that was created 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yes, to be clear,
some things still do not change.
To be clear, I would have rather bypassed this, but if I'm going to make it interoperable with how my systems run today, I really had to do that. So.
Yep. Okay, I understand that. Sorry, semantic issue.
With that, that's the end of Working Group 2.
Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then we'll go to the next piece, next section. We'll get you to your planes early if you're lucky. Okay, I think we've probably finished the easy part. Now the hard part comes. How are we going to get this report written? I'm going to turn this over to Brendan to talk about the new working groups that I think I talked with several of you about, and the follow-up tasks that are now at hand now that we've got the basic background material done.
Okay, so I think the agreement was that the working groups need a little bit more time to finalize their reports. So we were hoping that working group drafts could come in April 10th, which is 2 weeks from Friday, I believe. If that, I'm trying to make eye contact with some of the authors here. We're good on that? Yeah. Okay. Sure.
That doesn't sound very complete to me.
So the way, because the working groups are just kind of subcommittees of the full committee, they don't become the committee report until the full committee approves what's in them.
I understand that. I guess I'm trying to have you define what your expectation is to the finishedness level of the things that come in.
Something that the full committee would consider as a pretty complete report. I mean, obviously, because the full committee is not considering or not allowed to have direct input into the working group draft, we want to make sure that there's opportunity for edits from the full committee.
So done except editorial items.
Exactly.
Content done.
Right.
I have a related question, and this comes into the 2-week discussion. At least in Work Group 2, we have not really got to the discussion of OTT systems and or VidiPath, which Mark was mentioning. I think it could easily take us 2 weeks just to go through those, let alone write them down. Simply because there are quite a few. There are many variations of OTT system as well as these other variations, RVU, VidiPath, that have not been summarized. So I'm mindful that 2 weeks may not be enough.
Is that something that could be put into one of the other working groups?
Right.
Working groups?
So one of the next tasks that we have is to sort of get everyone's feeling on which of the next working groups they want to be on, and we're going to create 3 new working groups. One, a future trends working group, which we discussed at the last meeting. The second, a security component working group. And the third, a non-security APIs working group. The work on those working groups won't begin until the working groups 1 and working groups 2 submit their reports. So after April 10th, there will be meetings of those working groups, but we wanted to get everyone's feelings on which working group they feel most comfortable being on at this meeting. And so the over-the-top issues could be dealt with in the future trends working group.
I fear I must disagree with you, because over-the-top is definitely a future trend, but it's also a reality today. Right? You can count this as long as your arm of OTT services, as well as VidiPath. RVU has been in the market for many a year. So, there's definitely discussions on the future of IP and 4K and a bunch of stuff that could be discussed. But my comment was about capturing what's done today. For example, our friends in Google Fiber, Amazon, Netflix, which are tens of millions of users.
Right.
We've not covered that yet, and you will notice they were only mentioned briefly in Bob's report out simply because of time.
What do others think?
I was going to mention also, you have RVU, and then you have the new work in DLNA regarding CBP2, but we're kind of related to that is actually the whole home PVR, or the whole home networking solutions that MVPDs have as well. There may be, because if you kind of go down the RVU path or the CBP2 path, a lot of MVPDs are already kind of doing some type of home networking. And there could be an alignment there, with what's going on. So it would be more information, actually, maybe to try to analyze.
So, Cheryl, I don't think that I don't think that we really have time to deal with over the top, and I don't think we really should. I don't think it relates to 629 and Stella and Title VI services. I think until and unless there's some change in the rules that changes what an MVPD is, we should proceed without dealing with over the top for DSTAT.
Not for nothing, but Working Group 2 has the words over-the-top video in our instructions. So I think we have to deal with over-the-top based on the instructions we were given.
So the DBS architectures use a combination of DBS file delivery into DVRs as well as IP-delivered content when customers have broadband. We haven't yet defined a service. We've already talked about that. When I contemplate what the joint venture that Dish and Sling have launched for Sling TV, which I believe is an over-the-top service, I'm not arguing that it isn't. If we know forever that service is never going to have to use a downloadable conditional access, and that we were not told to study that kind of a service in the charge of this committee, if I know that, then I support not going into OTT, but I don't interpret the requirements that were handed to the FCC the same way you do, Adam. So I guess I'm looking to staff to make a determination if indeed they can tell us you'll never have to worry about this DCAS thing on Sling TV. Great, but if I do need to worry about it, then I better worry about it now, because I don't know if I'm going to have an opportunity to do so and in the future. I understand it is another big chunk of work, and I'm not shirking that work. I'm ready to do it. So That's my opinion, at least on either getting a firm ruling or let's deal with over the top as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the fundamental scope, right, of what the committee is working on. And I forget at this point what the Phase Zero doc actually said on the topic, but I think we need to have, that has to be the thing that provides guidance. I would say it was disappointing to me that there was not much investigation in the DVB ecosystem, because that is a system on a global basis that does accomplish most of the goals of this, and while it may not reflect any incumbent systems in the United States, some of the principles from those systems could be useful. And certainly programmers push high-value content over that ecosystem, et cetera. So not necessarily DVBs, but...
The DVB CI Plus system, and Robin, please correct me, there's a hardware security module in it, right? It's not a downloadable software.
Well, it looks like a cable card. It functions like a cable card. In our implementation, there's a smart card or a SIM card slot in it. And by the way, the microprocessor that Polycipher used was available in a SIM card. So you could, if you wanted to be perverse, you could make it a downloadable, smart card, removable cable card device at the same time. It's a business decision. I mean, seriously, that's actually how it shipped, with a smart card with a SIM card cut out inside a cable card.
And an IP connection in some cases.
And an IP connection in some cases. So I have just asked for the numbers because we were asking. I didn't know the numbers, just out of curiosity, so we can see how successful or not that particular device is. But remember, it's used, I think, 99.99% exclusively for connected TVs. There was, I think, one German set-top box that was a bit of an obscurity, but that was it. It's only for connected TVs.
So from TiVo, going back to Adam and Mark's comments, if it's helpful, I think we can split the baby and say, as Mark said, Working Group 2 was supposed to address OTT. As Adam would say, and as I brought up in the first DSTAC meeting, given that there's an NPRM out, hundreds of pages of debate going on around that, we should say it's out of scope in this, given that there's an existing NPRM.
I think the staff is going to give us some direction on this at some point, if not today, soon.
Not today, but yeah, we're going to consider everything that's been said in this meeting, discuss internally, and we will have feedback from the commission staff.
Jay?
So when you say future trends, I interpret that also as current trends, not stuff that's we've talked a lot about things that were established many years ago, so that's how I interpret that. I think that's what you mean, is not to stare into some crystal ball at something that may happen 10 years from now. So
that's my understanding.
Yeah, and it's more of just making sure that government process is not the speediest. So if this eventually ends up as an order, there would be an NPRM, there would be an order. It would be a long process to make sure that as soon as that order comes out, the rules go into effect, if that is what the end result is, that it's not already outdated.
Rear view mirror, right. And then can you elaborate on the security and non-security? You were going to provide some more detail on what those...
Right. So the security component working group would be the specific security elements. If we're going to go back into the opaque device or whatever you want, opaque box idea, kind of the inner workings of that, how to make sure that once content comes out of that, it continues to be protected. And then the non-security parts of that would be more of kind of the inputs and outputs of that.
I'm just a little concerned, back to my comment about let's define the what before the how. These feel a little bit like the how, and I'm a little nervous that we haven't completed the what. I don't know, maybe you can elaborate on that. So.
Right, and so we won't even be getting to these until the work on these won't even start until the Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 have their reports completed. Much of this is just a timing issue because there's not a meeting on that day.
Right. Okay. So, all right.
So, just a point of process. If the reports come out in a fashion that make these two working groups non-essential, would we then come up with two new working groups?
Well, that's at the discretion of the FCC, but yes, we would definitely consider that. And
okay. So, I mean, these are placeholders then, it sounds like, till the
Yeah.
reports are done, and then essentially these working groups could change. Although I do think the current and future trends, since we had agreed to that before, is pretty critical, no matter what, right? But I'd even suggest that the two working groups could even start to talk about commercial requirements for current and future trends and technology requirements for current and future trends. You can maybe extend them to the next meeting. By that time, you'd have a full report, and then you could start. Then you'd know exactly what the next two working groups are. Just a thought.
But it sounds like you're willing to be like take the flow into account as we evolve this and see, what happens in the next 2 weeks could influence and maybe not a right-hand turn or left-hand turn, but it could definitely sort of point us in different directions depending on where it goes.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
John?
So, if a DBS provider wanted to figure out how to exchange or how to enable the customers with appropriate hardware that they've decided they like the feature sets of, so that they could get the full range of provided VOD services, much like they do today that are pushed through the satellite system. When you say there's a security API and there's the other stuff API, I don't know which of those APIs are involved in a brand new feature that, as far as I know, doesn't exist anywhere, DVB or anywhere else, in terms of the prospective preloading of content before it's purchased by an end user. In other words, this is where you've got the release on Friday of the movie. It's VOD ready on Friday. Today, Dish would preload that content starting tomorrow on the consumer's hard drives, so that on Friday when it goes live, customers are able to buy it and watch it just like they could on other MVPD services. I don't know yet where to go to talk about those kinds of APIs, because there's absolutely a security component in that content has to be secured. When it's purchased, it has to be securely purchased. There's got to be some verifiability, et cetera, but also, presumably, if a device is going to implement or expose that chunk of a hard drive, say in a TiVo box, I'm going to need to be able to say, hey, I've got 3 gig of data coming down over the next X hours. Please get ready for that, and here's a bulk transfer of data. This is entirely jumping way, way, way into the hows before we know the whats. But this is where the whats are more important to me to understand if I should even be contemplating these hows, because maybe when you say you want full access to all of the streaming and purchasable content, when I hear that as an engineer, you want to be able to access all of the content, which absolutely means I need a way to store data on a secure portion of a consumer's hard drive. If I can't do that, then you don't really want access to all of the content that Dish offers, because that's a large part of the content. And then there's also a question on the IP side. More of those are on the security side, except that then we start talking about guide data. And as we've talked about in both of the working groups, we came at guide data, both DBS providers look at our guide data and our CAS systems, and we've integrated large chunks of features into both. You can't really separate them. We didn't have a cable card, say, cliff to worry about. We also have different lessons we've learned historically on the value of guide data and getting accurate guide data in that not other MVPDs may not have. They may have chosen to reach different conclusions. So again, we're going to be weird. I'm going to be weird in all 3 of these groups if these are the groups. There is one of me. There might be 2 of me soon, I hope. but there's not 3 of me. And I'm willing to join the groups. I'm trying to figure out when you ask me what group I want to join, I don't have an answer for you. I don't have an answer because.
If I may?
Yeah, please.
Devo, so John, I think you should embrace your weirdness, but use the flexibility that an opaque box type of solution gives you. You get to define it. And so if your network is unique and needs 3 gigabytes to serve VOD, put that in the opaque part. I mean, I would say you have the freedom to not say this is hard and I'm different, but also to say, here's my recommendation on what the outputs and the inputs are.
So if you're telling me I need to define the what is it that I'm building, I need close to 300 gigabytes. Actually, a lot more than that. Yes, if I knew what kind of what I was building, I'd be able to tell you some of those details, and I'd be able to say, you don't need to worry about that part because the kind of a thing I'm building will be able to take care of that. But if what I'm trying to specify is a downloadable piece of software, I have completely different requirements for a downloadable piece of software. That it not forget my customer purchased pay-per-view in between the time they purchased it and they connected up to a back channel to reconcile that call. That's a maybe unique requirement to me or to DBS. I don't know. I believe it's unique. I haven't heard it from others because others are operating two-way systems. So yes, I thank you, Joe. I am embracing my weirdness. I need to embrace my weirdness all over the place.
And again, I think it's more this freedom that if you know what's hard and what's easy about your systems, then you should take advantage that you could craft what is an output and what is just too hard to ask every TiVo and every television manufacturer to reserve 300 gigabytes. You're going to have to put that within your black box.
Okay.
Opaque box.
Opaque cube.
Thanks.
Okay, so
Where are we?
actually I need to go back to the sharing of drafts issue. We talked about this at lunch with our general counsel's office to prevent, just kind of put up a wall between the quorum issues. What I'm going to suggest is that the working group drafts that would go from working group 1 to working group 2 and vice versa, send them to either Cheryl or me, and we will share them with the other working group and act kind of as a buffer to prevent any quorum issues, contamination, exactly. And understand that the working group is responsible for the final product. So while you may take what the other working group says as a recommendation or a possible thing to think about, the working group itself is responsible for the content of that report. So it's not a collaborative effort necessarily. It's more of thanks for that input. We didn't think about that. We'd like to write something to address that issue, more than, thanks, here's 5 paragraphs that we'll just plug right in.
Brendan, just a quick process thing. Can you make I may have asked the question. Is it okay that they also be sent to the alternates?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
Sure.
That one. It keeps me from having to forward documents that I forget if I did or didn't, so that'd be better. Thanks. Perfect.
So on the working groups, one thing that Bob and I were chatting about is IP and what influence IP. Just like we've had an analog to digital conversion, there's almost as massive a digital to IP conversion going on. I know that a lot of us are looking at IP for delivery, but we were a little concerned that that's not been delved into enough. That is probably pretty informative on the what. Bob, you may want to add some comments, because I have some things I've heard you say, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
So I believe that some of the cable companies will be pushing towards IP very shortly, maybe even before we can come to some kind of consensus here, and that should we be concentrating first on an IP platform and the existing QAM platforms today, I don't believe we'll ever do a reverse back that these cable boxes today can be downloadable can be converted to a downloadable system. That's just not possible. So if we're going to say in the future, by the time we get to say we have to do a QAM box with a downloadable security, we may already be into an IP world. And from what I've gathered from a lot of my colleagues, we will be in that IP world shortly.
And you didn't cover that in your...
No, because this is just my personal knowledge of it. This is not, nobody else is coming out and telling us what they're going to do.
I do think going IP over QAM transport has been discussed in the industry for a very long time, unless you're talking about something different than IP over QAM.
I'm not talking about going over QAM, eliminating QAM in the networks.
So is there a recommendation? Or
I would...
It may be embodied in current and future trends, maybe, but it's a really key aspect that I think, to your point about wanting to stay ahead of the ball, that's the one I would worry about the most from what's changing, and we don't want to come out with something that's no longer it's there because it's legacy, and so legacy doesn't go away very fast, but it's not where all the focus is, and I think IP is inherently more flexible as well. So that's a positive attribute. So.
This is Brent from Evolution. Just for clarity's sake, when you talk about it in an IP format, in the traditional HFC, are you talking about a DOCSIS or fiber to home delivered?
A DOCSIS network.
Yeah. So
technically, DOCSIS is QAM.
Yeah. Let's call it DOCSIS QAM as opposed to
QAM, right? But it is over QAM. Yes. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that the existing QAM boxes today will not be able to do that.
Legacy QAM.
The legacy boxes will not be able to do it.
Sure. So for the staff, some of you may know this, just to make it really confusing, DOCSIS modems, which are our IP, our broadband to the home, actually modulate data on QAMs as well, but it's different than how we do the video. So technically it's still on a QAM, but they're very separate networks. So.
Just to confuse it a little, it's not MPEG-2 transport for the video on the DOCSIS network.
This comes back to my previous point that Workgroup 2 did not touch on pretty much any IP to systems except the IP that was used in AT&T and Verizon in their traditional deployments. We didn't go into how does TiVo work, for example. Haven't been discussed. I haven't discussed Google Fiber. We haven't discussed some of these other opportunities. Some of them are future, but some of them are submitting with OTT as well as these other things like Sling TV. It's now. It's not a trend. So we just didn't get time to do that. We went through the many and various traditional systems that exist.
You have 2 more weeks.
I'm just telling you my opinion. The Mythical Man month does not exist.
But the thing that's, sorry, Joe, let's just say, the thing that's, and we talked about this in Working Group 1, touched on it, and then it was like a flame that nobody wanted to touch, but trying to establish what are common elements across these very disparate distribution systems. I mean, they have very unique ways in which they've traditionally delivered video. Every one of the MVPDs, I think, within this group and beyond, have some IP video element, whether it's a separate VOD system that supplements their linear broadcast and satellite. In the case of cable, we're seeing a lot more IP delivered for TV everywhere, multi-screen, and so forth. But I think without question, every one of these players is fully intending on deploying video over IP, whether it's over an HFC network in QAM, or whether it's fiber and otherwise. So I do think that it's important that we do focus on that, because if we want to get to a consensus where we have a lot of mixed messages here, there's only one common format of delivery of video that is relevant to all of these platforms, and that's IP.
If I can, I was next.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I want to follow up on the commonality that Brent mentioned. What we brought up when we did discuss this IP delivery of video content, that, and I'm not trying to be facetious here, but in each case, whether it's coming from AT&T or Cablevision as an IPTV in the future, Frontier as a DSL customer, in all cases, they give me a box. Sometimes it's black, sometimes it's gray. And it has a common IP output. And so in some ways, the commonality there is IPTV is interesting because in all cases there is variations in network about QAM distribution of DOCSIS or DSL or fiber. But in all cases, now we have a common IP output. And I think it's just interesting for the larger group to understand in that discussion of IPTV, look at that possible future commonality.
And I agree with that, sorry, from a legacy standpoint. You know, all of these different companies are coming up with ways to convert their legacy content to maybe an IP format to be used with other devices in the home. But I think we could also look beyond that and say, okay, just because that's how it's done today, and there was no form or fashion or regulation to acquire that to be open. What we could talk about, I think, is just using, again, in an IP environment, establishing certain level types of DRM or establishing certain regulations or conformity that would allow a non-box environment.
So we should also make it clear in case it wasn't that IP doesn't necessarily mean over the top. I mean, you know, IP delivered video is terrific, but there's IP delivered video over, you know, a managed network, and there's IP delivered video over the wild internet, and they're different, really different services, really different delivery, and really different problems, and really different receivers involved.
John?
So a detail for Workgroup 2 to worry about, again, in the weirdness of satellite. Neither satellite provider also provides IP at the same time. I was going to call it broadband, but we've had definitions of broadband that change. So customers of both satellite providers who also have a broadband or broadband-like, nearly broadband class service are able to add additional IP streams into their service. Today, it's a single box that collects all of that information together and exposes it into the home network, or there's no box at all and it's your own tablet that connects up through the World Wide Web. Neither DBS provider operates a managed IP delivery network today, nor does it make sense to contemplate we'd switch our satellite delivery systems to IP either. That's possibly going to be a distinction that matters as we start talking about the difference between other service providers and DBS. So again, that's a point to throw out for Workgroup 2 for its next 2 weeks to consider, or maybe for the next phase of discussions. And again, Adam, this is back where over the top looks different to each of us. All of my IP is over the top already, so if you tell me not to talk about it, I don't think that's what you meant, but maybe it is what you meant. Don't worry about any over the top, which means never mind, I don't have any IP, which is not productive.
Jay?
And maybe to try and wrap on this, and I may not have the latitude to do this, but so I'm going to offer a counter proposal of how we do this, because I'm concerned that we do all the right homework to get to some of these things that to me feel a little bit more like the how. I'm a little worried about that, as you can tell. So perhaps Working Group 1 could, after these 2 weeks where we all do the remaining part of our homework, perhaps Working Group 1 could go on and focus on over-the-top current and future trends. I don't mean crystal ball. And Working Group 2 could latch onto this IP architectures and what's going on with IP and how make sure we've done the homework on IP delivery, and that we extend the group, the Working Group 1, Working Group 2 on those topics for readouts to the next face-to-face meeting that we have in May.
So you wouldn't reconstitute the working groups until after the May meeting?
Right, right. If we can take maybe, right, if we can take maybe a 5-minute break, and I can, talk to my bosses about that.
Okay.
That'd be helpful.
All right.
Well, look, before we, is everyone kind of comfortable with that sort of approach?
It might allow us to get into the other item we were supposed to, which is a commentary on scope and just some feedback on where we think we go at the end of that, perhaps, as well. I think that was one of the things you asked the working groups, and we really haven't gotten into yet.
Yeah, that's to Jay's point. That's the how. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I have a question for clarification. Your proposal is that the Workgroup 1 and Workgroup 2 get retasked as is until the May meeting.
Correct.
And Workgroup 1 will work on the future trends. So that was
current and future trends.
Current and future trends. Current and future trends,
and
as was the Workgroup 1 that was specified in the new arrangement. So it sounds like a little bit of the other work would start. The former Workgroup 3 would start, is what you're proposing. We used to have a Workgroup 3, which hasn't started yet, which was
yes,
current and future trends.
Right.
So that thing would start in Workgroup 1 and Workgroup...
And over the top.
And
over the top.
And over the top. And Workgroup 2 is working on
IP
but not over the top.
Correct.
IP architecture.
IP architecture.
Would you include IP in the home network? Like the CVP2 type stuff, home PVR.
Maybe we should take a break, but I actually think that if we get into home network, I'm very concerned about that. That seems like a very large increase in scope. Speaking for Charter, we're not doing any home networking, so it's not even.
So yours would be simple.
I'm not sure I really like the idea of just retasking Working Group 1 and letting it persist to the next meeting. I think I'd rather, if we can do what we set out to do and bring it to some conclusion and then reform in a way that makes sense, that seems like a better way forward. I don't think that the same sort of questions are in the requirements and current and future trends. I think they're sort of different sorts of questions, and I'm concerned that the formulation of that group might not be quite right, and I'd like to.
Which group?
Sorry, the set of people in the different groups. I'm not sure there's the right balance in Working Group 1 for a current and future trends discussion as there was for a requirements discussion.
Okay. One more, and then we'll take a break.
I just want to make sure that we discuss the various options so that when you have a discussion, you know what we're basing off of. Actually, I share some of the concerns that waiting to go all the way to May put us behind schedule. I know I'm also the person who said, hang on 2 weeks is not enough, but perhaps there's a middle ground. I think in Workgroup 2 we're probably looking at, this is just my personal opinion right now, at least 3 weeks. So, maybe we want to find some in-between point. If we do find some in-between point, whether we go the April 10th or we do April 17th or whatever the next one is after that, I think it might be useful, I don't know, again, how this is possible, that we convene some meeting, even by teleconference, just to kind of share and sync up on the results of those things before we started instigating some new working committees, sheerly because we need to ensure communication between all members of the DSTAC committee.
Fair point. Okay, let's take 5:10 maybe?
Yeah, 3:15 will be good.
Somebody back there? There we go. Okay, let's finish up. Okay, Brendan. What are we going to do?
Okay. So, sounds like more time is necessary. So, extend to April 17th for the Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 drafts. To the extent you can incorporate the idea of IP into those, I think that would be very helpful. And then once we receive those reports, we'll use those to consider how we're going to constitute the next working groups, define the work that those working groups will be tasked with. We'll define those, ask people to, I guess, nominate themselves to be on the various working groups, kind of the ranking thing that we did at the last meeting. And we'll go from there, and there will be...
To float an idea, maybe what we should do that would be make this a little easier is meet between now and meet in late April. And I'm okay. Matt has to come the farthest, but Milo and Matt, but I'm willing to come. I'm willing to come from. Okay, all right. There's a bunch of us.
I'll host in Silicon Valley.
But I'd be willing to come from Colorado for another meeting. I think it sounds like it might be useful, so I thought I'd throw that out as an idea.
Okay, that's something. Just logistically, getting this room is extremely difficult. But I can look to do that if folks want to do that.
Could we host it somewhere else? Or does it have to be just here? I'd be happy to host in Silicon Valley.
So
we would too.
We can't. I've asked our general counsel's office about doing that, and it's a pain because it has to be a public meeting. There are accessibility issues. All.
You can't have too nice of a venue.
Those are public.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can't. Like I said, we have accessibility issues, public issues. It has to be in this room. I've tried. I've asked for flexibility on that. I can't get in. The next point that I wanted to speak about is outlines. Eventually there's going to be a full delivered report, and it would be nice to, as early as we can, start thinking about how the full report should look. I think what makes sense, Cheryl and I have discussed this, and it might make sense for each working group, to the extent you can, come up with an outline for how you think the final report should look. I know that doesn't necessarily fit right in with the working group tasks, but the nice thing with the working groups is that we have established balance. So if you can come to some consensus about how you think the final report should look, just a high-level chapter outline more than anything would help us in constituting the next working groups. I don't know if folks, I see a couple nods. That's good.
So you've given us another week, but you've also given us more work. Do I understand correctly?
Yes.
Sounds like my boss. I don't know about you.
And another deadline close to April 15th.
Uncle Sam. Okay, and I think that's...
Is that it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know that some folks wanted a more guidance on scope. I think we want to see what the working groups come up with before we can give a definite answer on that. Today was actually quite helpful, and we're going to take that back and consider it, but we don't have a clear statement on that for right now. Sure.
You said each working group to come up with an outline of, and if it passes any prediction in the future, perhaps there might not be agreement. Do they have to come to agreement on what that is? Do you have multiples? Maybe each comes up with 2, 3, or 4?
That's fine.
What we didn't want was 19. To the extent you can keep it under 19, that would be great. But because every member has different interests.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else anybody wants to raise right now before we open it up to the public? Good. Excellent. Anyone from the audience want to make any comments?
Got an open mic over here.
Thank you. Ralph, can people hear me? Ralph Brown, Cable Labs. The topic of DVB came up as a system of reference, and in particular I think it was about DVB-CI, the common interface, essentially the European version of cable card. And one point I did want to make sure for the record that was clear is in Europe, the common interface is mandated on the television manufacturer. So the television manufacturer is required to implement the DVB-CI Plus slot in Europe. And I am interested in any numbers that Robin may be able to provide in terms of how much success that has had. My understanding is it's fairly limited. So I think in terms from a regulatory perspective, looking at how and where you apply those, even in Europe, it may not have been as successful, even if it was mandated on the other side of the interface.
Yeah, and Ralph, I was raising it not as a regulatory model for the U.S. to follow, because this isn't a regulatory policy group, but just in terms of a crypto system architecture that's in wide-scale use, it may have lessons for us going forward. That was the reason I brought it up.
Right. But in fact, the cable card is based on the DVB-CI specification.
Well, we don't. Yeah, things have evolved over there too.
Right.
So.
We did copy protection first.
Steve?
Hello again. Steve F. Ross, BBT. I've already talked to Bob about this. He mentioned in his report about looking at the existing DCAS and mentioning Cablevision and Charter's DCAS. And of course there is another one, and that's BBT's DCAS. The difference is BBT isn't on the committee and Charter and Cablevision are, so it was understandable that he was looking at those primarily. But the capabilities are essentially the same in terms of the answer to the question that was asked, which was, well, can you deal with the existing technology, whether it is PowerKey or VideoCipher? And the answer, as they have found, is yes, we could do that. It's a private agreement that has to be reached, but yes, it's licensable and it's doable theoretically. The elephant in the room, it seems to me, from what we listened to today, is that there's been very little discussion about security and a whole lot of discussion about what we used to call AllVid or gateways and all of the surrounding issues of what are we going to do about user interfaces and what about the guides and all of that. And I would like to remind you again, as I did at the last meeting, that there is conceptually a way to separate security from all of those other issues. And I'm not entirely sure, I mean, Adam was the one who raised the issue of saying, well, 629 and Stella don't really mention the word OTT. And the mandate for this committee was downloadable security. It wasn't the policy of whether you include things like guides and all of those other things. There are rulemaking proceedings ongoing about things like AllVid and things like MVPD definitions. And it might be a consideration for this committee to avoid the the clear, sharp elbows that are going on here, and just stick with looking at security as opposed to, and there are ways, as I said, I mean, BBT is one of them, we're not the only one, that separates security out from all of those other issues, and let the FCC or whoever the policymakers are decide the other issues. I'd also like to point out that the question of whether you include OTT or not, I just look at from the point of view of being a consumer. And if you're talking about consumers going to Best Buy or wherever and buying a new navigation box, but that new navigation box, because this committee decided it wasn't going to think about OTT, it was only going to think about these other things, couldn't use Roku or couldn't work with Netflix or didn't work with whatever the next OTT iteration is of some intellectual property, as a consumer, I'd say, what the hell are you doing? So it just seems to me, if you put yourself in a consumer's point of view and then say, well, we're going to separate out the boxes again, and we're only going to deal with the boxes for cable and satellite and maybe what we call IP, but it's not really OTT IP, you will have totally confused the consumer. And maybe if I'm going to be a cable guy, I'd say that's great because they'll finally just throw their hands up and say, oh, hell, I'm just going to go with the cable operator. But I'd just like to point out that not talking about OTT in the context of a new consumer box doesn't seem to make any sense to me whatsoever. So those are my comments.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay, I think we're done for the day. Thank you again for your prodigious work. You really outdid yourselves. Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Hey, Brett.